Hey guys. Tonight we slip out of the wind and duck through a low timber doorway into a long, firelit Norse hall on the far winter coast. Salt spray still clings to your cloak while snow rattles the turf roof, and you can already feel the warmth breathing toward you from within. You stamp off flakes, stoop beneath a carved beam nicked with knotwork pines, and follow a ribbon of ember light toward the central hearth where people are settling blankets and furs for the night. You probably wouldn't last long if you tried to overwinter here in just a t-shirt. But that is why we are time traveling in story mode. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You edge closer to the hearth trench that runs like a glowing spine down the center of the hall. Excavated Viking Age longhouses from Norway, Iceland, and Greenland repeat the same broad plan. Stout posts or wall frames, low sides banked in turf or plank, and a long fire feature that fed cooking, craft work, light, and life-saving heat through months when the sun barely clears the horizon. Smoke lifts into the darkened roof space. Vents or louvers let some of it drift. The rest seasons every beam until even wood smells of winter stew and seawater. Along the walls, daytime benches become sleeping platforms. Layered straw, seagrass, or dried heather sacks ride under thick woven coverlets and reindeer or sheepskins. Families cluster by kin and warmth, not by private rooms with doors and hinges. Archaeologists still argue whether status determined who slept nearest the hearth. Charred plank patterns cannot tell us which cousin claimed which pelt. But sagas and experimental farmsteads hint at a flexible, communal sprawl. You tuck beside a pile of cloaks. The boards creak like an old ship settling at tide. The light is low, but never harsh. Whale oil lamps and shallow soapstone cups bead flame along the hearth edges. Now and then, someone feeds resin-rich pine splints for a brief flare, so tools can be shifted or a sleepy goat nudged back from the embers. Dogs curl at boot tips. A cradle board rests between two bedrolls. The baby inside is swaddled so thick you see only a red nose and a fist the size of a hazelnut. If you listen harder still, you catch soft counting. Someone in the far alcove is measuring breaths with a quiet prayer to the coming sun. Space is negotiated constantly. In some regions, people built separate byres for cattle. In others, especially harsher sites, animals shared low-roofed ends with humans because warm bodies waste no heat. Reconstructions in Iceland show dung channels and plank partitions. Norwegian folk museums display raised thresholds meant to slow drafts. Whether your host household uses any of these tricks tonight is one of those lived details the soil record rarely captures, and one of the reasons bedtime visiting beats digging. A child presses a palm-sized stone wrapped in scrap wool into your hand. It was heated in the embers and slipped beneath bedding to start the night toastier. One of countless small, practical charms. Someone else shows a sliver of whale baleen used as a springy backrest wedge. Another knots a strip of seal hide across a drafty seam. None of this is high myth. Yet, it is the quiet ingenuity that lets people sleep through weeks when daylight is a thin coin flicked across the southern sky. The long dark bends time. Evening stretch, folks mend gear, carve bone pins, and trade stories until eyes droop. You may drift, wake, and drift again. Something close to a two-part night that later writers notice in other pre-industrial cultures, and that we will gently revisit when talk turns to northern sleep patterns. Even here, myth rides the edges of daily life. Someone has smeared a tiny tree form in soot on the beam above the hearth. Another hung a hammer-shaped pendant beside a sprig of dried rowan. These are not temple offerings, but household gestures, halfway between prayer and habit, meant to keep luck close and whatever wanders in storm wind politely outside. Listen. Beyond the crackle you hear surf thudding a rocky inlet, and above, wind pushes snow dust through the smoke hole so it sparkles in firelight like stars caught indoors. A Skald tuning his lyre on the far bench will soon speak of Yggdrasil, the world tree that holds 9 realms in its roots and branches. But first, you just breathe. Slow, even, letting wool oils, tarred beams, and peat smoke blend into a lullaby you can smell. Mainstream fact: Norse longhouses really did center daily life around a longitudinal hearth, with people eating, working, and likely sleeping alongside platforms in shared warmth during the darkest season. Quirky tidbit: warmed sleep stones or reheated soapstone cooking slabs tucked into bedding are attested in cold northern households and fit what little we know of Viking winter comfort hacks. Historians still argue whether every rural farm truly kept people, animals, and stored goods under one continuous roof all winter, or whether mixed layouts were more common region by region. So you settle, shoulders loosening, as fire pops and rafters sigh. What begins as survival becomes ritual, and in that drowsy edge of night, you are ready to follow story routes outward toward Yggdrasil and the quiet charms people trusted to keep uneasy dreams at bay. You ease away from the hearth's glow and duck through a narrow side door cut in turf and plank. Cold night folds around you, pine sweet and salt damp, as the long hush of a winter fjord opens wide above the roofline. Snow kicked from boots flares ember orange behind you. Ahead, the bay lies black as hammered iron, and thin smoke threads from scattered farmsteads stripe the stars. Your host presses a hand torch toward you, a short stick wrapped in fish oil cloth and birch pitch. It sputters, smells like harbor nets, and throws just enough light to find frozen ruts without waking the whole settlement. Many northern households kept grab torches or fat-soaked splints for quick night errands once the central fire was banked. Tiny portable sparks against months of darkness. You shield the flame, crunch over drift crust, and follow a strip of trampled straw between sheds while sparks whirl up like restless fireflies and vanish on the wind. Out here you feel how people counted life by night. In older northern reckoning, the year was broadly split into winter and summer, and time itself might be tallied in nights. Legal deadlines and feast invitations could be set so many nights hence. The deep season turning was marked at winter nights, a short cluster of observances that might include offerings, welcoming travelers, and planning work under snow. Old Norse law passages and saga hints call this Veturnætr. Surviving sources do not hand us a uniform rulebook. Valley weather, sea ice, and local customs surely change timing. So historians still argue whether farm families everywhere paused for the same rites, or whether winter began whenever the first real dark settled in their hills. Boot prints creak across crusted snow. From an outbuilding where seal fat renders you catch a ribbon of oily smoke. The yard smells of pine resin, kelp salt, wet wool, and the sour tang of fermenting fish barrels. The pantry perfume of a coast that must feed itself until thaw. Dark racks tower against the white, split cod and stockfish stiffening in dry cold. Future cargo for when ships can sail south. Not tonight. Tonight the only voyage is in story and sleep. Look up. Soft green veils stir across the stars, the Aurora. In tales shared through the north, lights like these might be armor flashing in a distant sky battle, sparks from spirits racing the firmament, or a glimpse of Bifrost, the bridge linking realms beneath Yggdrasil. Others grin and call them foxfires kicked up by unseen paws. Whatever the telling, the slow shimmer is pure bedtime pacing. Your breathing falls into rhythm with the waves of color sliding over the fjord, while frost crystals ring the roof edge like tiny bells. The long dark reshapes rest. When daylight shrinks to a pale coin, chores crowd the brief noon and evening stretch. People talk, doze, mend gear, wake for animal checks, share ale, murmur short prayers, and drift again. Centuries later, European writers describe first sleep and second sleep. Whether northern households in the Viking Age kept that exact two-sleep rhythm is uncertain. Yet saga moments, neighbors crossing night snow between hearths to trade news or sing quietly, fit a world where waking after midnight does not alarm anyone. You might simply visit, stoke embers, and slide back under furs. A lean-to shelter holds sleds, rope, and rolled travel bedding, wadmal wool wraps lined with fur against frost. Your host flips one open. In the fold rests a twist of dried angelica root, peppery, nose-clearing, chewed before lying down to freshen breath after fish suppers. Quirky? Absolutely. Still, northern herb lists praise angelica, bog myrtle, and other strong plants for winter comfort. So tucking a strip in a sleep roll makes homely sense. If the taste offends, your host jokes, wedge it near the nose and breathe through the good side. You crunch toward the animal end. Cattle breath fogs a plank gap. Sheep shift and ring tiny bells. In leaner sites, people in stock sometimes shared connected roofs, so warmth was not wasted, though thresholds, manure drains, sleeping lofts, and smoke vents differed by wealth and region. Archaeologists read post holes, dung layers, insect remains, and soot stains to model mixed buyer-dwelling plans. Yet soil blur and later rebuilds complicate the picture. Archaeologists are not sure whether close sleeping with animals was an every-night winter practice or a hard-weather backup used when storms sealed doors. A guest crossing the yard hums a half-sung weather charm to keep drifts friendly. People everywhere talk to weather. So why not fjord snow? Your torch gutters. You pinch it out rather than carry smoke inside and follow overlapping boot tracks toward the amber slice of the main door. Warmth rolls over you, peat, tarred beams, wet wool beginning to steam. Bedding heaps have grown since you stepped out. Cloaks and pelts mound along the side platforms, while folk shake snow from boots and negotiate who sleeps where. You slide back to your corner with Aurora green still bright behind your eyes, as if you tucked a scrap of sky inside your hood. Soon you settle to watch how boards, straw sacks, and pelt layers turn communal benches into night nests for whole families. That quiet engineering of warmth and closeness is where you are headed next. Mainstream fact: Old Norse tradition preserves a seasonal turning called Veturnætr, winter nights, showing how strongly darkness structured calendar and gathering across the north. Quirky tidbit: dried angelica root kept in bedding and chewed before sleep appears in northern herb lore and fits long, fish-heavy winters when breath needed help. Historians still argue how the long, dark altered sleep schedules. Evidence hints at segmented nights and between-house visits, but patterns likely varied widely from fjord farm to inland valley. Back inside, the hall has thickened into bedtime. Cloaks that once hung to dry now become soft walls as people stake out their stretches of plank. Smoke rides low. Red light pools along the central trench, and the air smells of warmed tar, wet wool turning sweet, and the grassy dust of fresh shaken straw sacks. Someone pats the boards beside them and waves you closer. You're about to learn why northern families could sleep through months of cold that would send most modern thermostats screaming. Day benches convert first. Along each long wall run raised timbers wide enough to sit and work by firelight. At night, they're cleared of tools, bowls, and carded wool, then padded. Dried straw stuffed in linen or wadmal sleeves goes down as the mattress. Where straw is scarce, people rake seagrass, heather, or shredded birch bark, anything springy and dry. You squeeze a sack, crackly, faintly salt from kelp fields. Not memory foam, but when heat from the hearth drifts under the plank lip, the whole platform feels surprisingly kind. Over the fill come textiles. Heavy wadmal blankets, coarse, dense, lanolin rich, lockout drafts. Furs stack in order, reindeer over straw for loft, sheepskin for softness, seal or bear at the edge to shed melt when boots drag snow. Trade scraps show up like secret riches. A sliver of blue silk sewn to a pillow edge, a tablet woven red band rescued from a worn tunic, even imported striped cloth from far to the south stitched into a patchwork cover. Every bright scrap becomes a star in the dim hall. You track them the way you tracked Aurora ribbon outside. Who sleeps where? Warmth, kinship, chores, and livestock rhythms all tug the layout. Parents cluster children between them. Elders claim the low smoke end. Guests are folded into open gaps so no heat goes to waste. Privacy is improvised. A hanging cloak, a turned shield, a row of storage chests acting like a shallow fence. In some wealthier halls, carved high-back seats of honor double as more sheltered sleep spots. And later, medieval northern houses develop box beds that slide you behind panels. Whether Viking Age farms already used full enclosed bed closets is debated. Wood rots. And saga descriptions may reflect later practice or idealized memory. You shift your feet, and something smooth rolls out. warmed soapstone cooking slab wrapped in wool, still radiating heat. Bed warmers matter. We saw starter stones earlier, and here's the deluxe version. A flat slab heated under stew, cooled enough not to scorch bedding, then slipped beneath layers for the first hour of rest. A child demonstrates by plunging their toes under the wrap and sighing loud enough to raise laughter up the rafters. Another sleeper sprinkles dried bog myrtle shreds near a pillow seam. Its sharp scent joins juniper smoke wafting from the hearth. A homegrown blend people trust to freshen air and maybe nudge biting insects elsewhere. Northern herb lists include both plants, whether they truly cut pests or just made winter smell like summer marsh. No one complains. Lice combs hang ready. Bone combs with teeth so fine they could shame modern filters dangle from thong loops above bedding. Quick passes before lying down slow the crawl of unwanted bedfellows. Wool caps, hoods, and night coifs help too. You joke that you'll never grumble about fitted sheets again. Someone flicks you with a braid of spun goat hair and promises you haven't met spring shedding season yet. Listen to the hall settle. Snoring begins in polite test puffs, grows, then merges with goat rustle from the byre end. Dogs thump tails. A churn lid clacks when a sleeper turns. Outside, surf hits in long, slow sets that sync with breathing across the room. Communal sleeping means communal noise. But the noise, because it is everyone's, becomes blanket sound, the white noise machine of the Viking Age. Small protective objects mark personal patches. A bronze Thor's hammer pendant dangles from a peg above a toddler's head. Beside it, a tiny stitched pouch rattles, perhaps dried herbs, perhaps iron filings. Perhaps nothing but a mother's promise. A guest lays his knife on the far side of the bedding. Edge away, handle toward the sleeper. A gesture that says, safe among friends. Scratched rune slips tucked into pillow seams survive only rarely in the ground. Yet rune sticks found in Bergen and elsewhere show people were perfectly willing to label objects, trade messages, and carve jokes, jotting a brief charm against bad dreams into soft wood fits the culture and the bedside moment. Mainstream fact: excavations and reconstructions of Viking Age and early medieval Scandinavian longhouses show sidewall benches or platforms that served by day for work and by night as communal sleeping areas padded with organic fills and covered by textiles and furs. Interior hearth heat and shared bodies were key to surviving long winters. Quirky tidbit: warmed soapstone cooking slabs, herb bundles like bog myrtle, and even tooth-fine bone lice combs appear in northern contexts and would have doubled as bedtime comfort hacks. Historians still argue the degree of privacy, open platforms for most versus partially enclosed bed closets or curtain bays for higher status, because wooden superstructures vanish and saga references mix time layers. You tuck into your borrowed corner, toes under the residual heat stone, bog myrtle sharp in your nose, watching ember light ladder up smoke-black rafters. Across the hearth, the Skald lifts his carved staff. From warmth and wool, you'll follow him next into the branches of Yggdrasil itself. You feel conversation limp to a whisper as the Skald rises from the far bench, carved staff in hand, ember light striping his cheekbones like bark. He taps the staff once on a hearthstone, and the long hall seems to lean in. Smoke rolls low under the rafters, sparks hang like red seeds, and every blanket rustle settles as if snow itself is listening. He does not mount a platform. He stands among bedrolls, because Skalds worked in the same rooms where people mended nets, trimmed sled runners, carded wool, and sometimes scorched stew. Court poets served kings, yes, yet wandering makers of verse also carried news, praise, teasing insults, and memory to farmsteads strung along fjords. A clever stanza might commemorate a voyage, flatter a host, or tuck advice inside a riddle. Tonight his work is softer, to rock a winter hall towards sleep by hanging a universe from a story branch. He sweeps the staff through smoke, leaving a soot ribbon you track with your eyes. Imagine, he murmurs, that the post beside your head is not pine, but the trunk of a vast tree whose roots drink distant wells, whose crown brushes realms of gods, whose middle limb cradles the world where you lie wrapped in wool. Far below, frost giants mutter, something scaled worries bark, and somewhere a squirrel chatters gossip between high and low. You are, he says, camping halfway up a cosmic trunk. Texts preserved in Iceland centuries after the Viking Age, especially the mythic poems now gathered as the Poetic Edda and Snorri Sturluson's later prose accounts, speak of a mighty world tree named Yggdrasil binding many realms. They mention Urd's well where fates are set, Mimir's deep draught of wisdom, and springs that steam beneath colder lands. They place gods in lofty Asgard, everyday people in Midgard, and other beings in their own reaches. However much Christian scribes shaped what survived on parchment, those texts preserve echoes of older northern imaginings in which a single enormous tree held sky, earth, and underworld in uneasy balance. He crouches and wraps the staff on floorboards so sparks leap. See the cracks between planks, he says. Roots seeking water. See smoke drifting out the roof louvre. Branches sifting starlight. Children wiggle fingers upward to make twig shadows. Someone snickers. Another mimics a squirrel streaking the rafters to carry jokes to whatever gnaws the cellar. If your own family tree looked like this, he teases, you would need sled dogs just to visit cousins at solstice. He hums a refrain naming creatures that haunt the story tree. An eagle riding the topmost sky, a hawk poised between its eyes, antlered deer nibbling high buds, the gossiping squirrel Ratatosker racing messages, and the dragon Nidhogg worrying deep roots. Listed in written sources almost like margin doodles around the cosmology, they become here a drowsy puppet show in Firelight. Kids claim parts, hands antler, braids become tails, the dog yawns for dragon, and for a moment the longhouse ceiling behaves like a canopy alive with travelers. Household art picks up the idea in small ways. Burn-marked branching glyphs darken rafters in some folk collections. Spindle whorls carry radiating scratches. Gaming pieces show ringed patterns that resemble layered worlds. Whether any mark deliberately meant Yggdrasil is impossible to prove. Yet people everywhere turn big beliefs into small hand habits. Your host shows you a spoon handle scored with 3 notches at the tip, 3 at the butt, and a cluster round the grip. Her grandmother said top for gods, bottom for roots, middle for us. Accurate cosmology, maybe not, but as a bedtime object to hold while storms hiss, it works. Some families twist horsehair tassels and hang them from roof beams so dangling strands suggest roots. Others tie green yarn each spring and say the tree leaves in the hall. None of these tiny gestures prove doctrine, they prove attachment. Scholars still debate the botany and geometry of the world tree. The Old Norse element asker suggests ash. Yet Yu's longevity tempts others, and some argue the name is poetic metaphor, not botany. The famous 9 worlds are likewise slippery. Sources imply 9, but which 9 depend on how lines are read, and archaeology does not hand us tidy labeled models. Placement of elves, dwarfs, giants, and land spirits shifts across poems and prose, raising the possibility that cosmology varied by telling, performer, and audience mood. His voice drops, heat softens, coals settle, drift, snow hiss, taps the roof. Lie back, he says, and line your breaths with the tree. Inhale up the trunk toward bright halls of Asgard. Exhale down through soil, cold roots curled round hidden wells. Count branches instead of sheep. Sap becomes the slow tide sliding under fjord ice. Embers become stars in the crown. Dew dripping from high twigs becomes the morning rime that will bead ship rails when spring comes. With each long breath, the hall turns to bark, rafters to limbs, and your straw sack to a safe nest wedged between worlds. Someone near the hearth murmurs a short charm asking the tree to carry dreams safely. Another traces 3 quick lines on a pillow seam as if marking roots. Trunk, crown. Whether such gestures were common in the Viking Age or are later folk habits folded back into memory is uncertain, but they settle the room like extra blankets. Before he sits, he plants his staff upright beside the hearth, so its carved tip points through the smoke hole toward the Aurora outside. Tomorrow, he promises, he will show how a painted shield face can hold the whole tree if you trace its rings carefully. That promise glows in ember light, a map waiting to unfold in your hands as night deepens and story roots take hold. Mainstream fact: Norse literary sources, especially the poetic Edda and Snorri's prose Edda, describe Yggdrasil as a great tree linking realms such as Asgard and Midgard, with wells like Urds at its roots and beings, including Ratatoskr and Nidhogg along its span. Quirky tidbit: notched spoons, hanging tassels, and branching burn marks on household objects show how families can miniaturize cosmic trees into bedtime comfort charms even when meaning is uncertain. Historians still argue the species implied by the name, the exact roster of so-called 9 worlds, and how widely ordinary households imagine cosmology beyond what later Icelandic texts record. Morning never really blazes this far north in winter. It seeps. When enough gray has pooled under the smoke hole to tell day from night, the Skald fishes a round shield from the wall peg above your bedding and eases it down between pelts as if unveiling a board game. Frost haze still rims its iron boss. Chipped paint rings ladder outward, pale green. Soot black, faded red, each band flaked and smoke-buffed by years of hanging over fires. He pats the central metal like a drumhead, Last night we climbed the world tree in our heads, he says. Today we map its realms on a thing you can hold. Viking Age shields, where they survive in graves or bogs, are typically light plank discs faced in hide, gripped by a central handhole under a domed boss. Paint traces, red, yellow, black, linger on a few, telling us color mattered though full patterns rarely endure. Reenactors and lab reconstructions show just how quick thin planks can be if you need to travel. A good shield is also a handy teaching circle when ships are iced in and children want stories. The Skald spins the disc so the boss becomes your sun, and rings become layered worlds. He dabs a fingertip in Hearth soot and dots a small arc just beyond the boss. This, he says, let us call Midgard, the middle enclosure where you and I are trying not to roll into the fire while we draw. Outside that arc, he sweeps a larger crescent. Beyond the fence, wild lands, Jotun country, shore ice, strangers you have not married into yet. Further ring, seas, coils, the unknown. At some tables, this is where serpents sleep. Kids lean in with charred twigs and add tiny stick cows, boats, and a goat that looks suspiciously like the one actually chewing a shoe thong by the door. You flick the rim, the hollow thunk echoes. Someone jokes that if all 9 realms fit here, they weigh less than a stew lid. 9 is a tricky number. Later written sources list many places. Asgard for gods, Midgard for humans, Vanaheim for Vanir, Jotunheim for giants, Alfheim for elves, Svartalfheim or Nidavellir for darker craftsmen, Hell for the underworld dead, Muspel and Nifl, fire and mist at the extremes, and commentators count until they reach 9. Yet which entries qualify shifts by poem and prose. Historians still argue whether audiences in the Viking Age heard a fixed cosmology or flexible lists tailored to verse and occasion. Your soot map shrugs formal math. The Skald says count however many you need to fall asleep. Paint ghosts become terrain. That pale green ring? Call it leafy Asgard. That dark one beyond? Maybe the chill of Niflheim, the hot chips near a scorched scar? Muspel sparks, where the hide facing once pulled loose. A tear now reads like a river gap. Slip your finger through and you travel between worlds. For bedtime purposes, he grins. Any draft hole in an old shield is a portal if you name it so. Households improvise cosmograms. Some families scratch simple concentric circles into bread trenchers. Others stitch radiating bands on a child's blanket so bedtime story fingers can wander realms. Icelander turf farms display spindle whorls scored in spokes, a useful pattern for counting wool turns, but also handy for telling where God spins sky from earth if you are 5 and refusing sleep. In one West Norwegian folk legend recorded much later, a world tree grows from the center of a round baking board. Every slice taken from the loaf feeds a different land. Whether these tales descend from Viking cosmology or later fusions is open. People retrofit myths to objects they already touch. You trace from boss to rim slowly, matching breaths. Inhale at sun gloss over iron. Exhale across soot, Midgard. Pause at the chipped red band the Skald calls wall of flame. Inhale again where hide has peeled to raw plank. Your path toward mist wells and hidden roots. Counting rings becomes counting sheep with extra dragons. Someone ties a bit of green yarn around the grip thong, so next time the child who owns this shield can jump straight to Leafy Branch World when asking for story at night. Mainstream fact: surviving Viking Age round shields show plank construction. Central iron or metal alloy bosses, hide coverings, and occasional paint residues indicating colored surfaces that could support simple patterns, circles, divisions, bands, useful as quick teaching aids. Quirky tidbit: families have long turned everyday objects into cosmology toys. Concentric cuts on platters, whorl spokes, and patched blankets can serve as miniature realms for bedtime mapping, whether or not originally intended. Historians still argue the canonical list and ordering of the so-called 9 worlds of Norse cosmology. Textual sources vary, and archaeological evidence cannot confirm household diagrams. You hand the shield back, soot under nails, breath slower from ring tracing. Outside, pale daylight leans against snow. Inside, story circles spin like sparks, ready to widen into herbs, runes, and pocket charms tucked near pillows when we curl down again tonight. You follow pale daylight to the side bench where bedding is being shaken out for the next stretch of long dark. Straw hisses, furs flap, and a drift of chaff sparkles in the thin sun dripping through the smoke hole. With the sleeping platforms cleared, your hosts begin the small, careful work that turns ordinary headrests into boundary stones between safe dreams and whatever prowls a winter night. Stitches, herbs, rune slips, and pocket charms no larger than your thumb. Pillows here are seldom cloud soft. Most are linen or wadmal sleeves packed with chopped straw, dried marsh grass, or mixed feathers scavenged across seasons. Lumps get shifted nightly, so softness is layered and meaning is sewn. A mother opens a seam and slides in a twist of dried sweet gale and crushed juniper tips, the same scents that curled in hearth smoke last night. Because sharp green smells cheer stale winter air and, people say, invite cleaner breathing. Archaeobotanical samples from northern farmsteads and turf house latrines turn up pollen and plant bits of bog myrtle, angelica, and juniper among domestic debris, whether always medicinal, aromatic, or purely practical. They fit snugly into bedtime sachets. In richer burials, archaeologists sometimes find trace down clumps clinging to metal fittings, hinting that high-status sleepers rested on softer fills than the straw most farms used. Whether that luxury touched common travel pillows is unknown. Next come the marks. Your host lays thin slivers of whittled pine across a board and scratches runes with a small knife. Some slivers bear plain ownership tags, the opening sound of a household name to keep bedding from wandering on coastal voyages. Others stack characters many later readers label protective, like the elk antler form modern rune guides call algies, or stave bundles echoing tree branches. In waterlogged deposits at Briggen and Bergen, hundreds of runic inscriptions on wood preserve, everything from business tallies to love messages to rapid scribbles that look suspiciously like quick charms. If people wrote at the wharf, they surely carved marks at home. A child wants her own charm. She digs in a pouch and produces a bead of amber cloudy as frozen honey and a bent iron nail. Trophies traded from summer voyages. The amber is sewn to a corner tassel. The iron gets wrapped in wool and tucked deep inside. Across the north, many households credited iron with discouraging troublesome land spirits or wandering elves. Amber carried sun warmth and stories of distant coasts. Mixing both beside a sleeper's head builds a layered shield. Light, earth, forge, travel. Someone passes you a cloth triangle rattling softly. Inside sit crushed eggshell, dried kelp, and 3 hairs from a favorite sheep. The maker laughs that the rattle's only power is to make a traveling child giggle before bed. If laughter chases uneasy dreams, that counts as protection in any language. Households everywhere invent such private amulets. Few survive soil and centuries, which is why archaeologists grin whenever textile ghosts cling to metal pins near the head area in burials. Were those little clumps scent sachets, status trims, or bedside charms? The soil keeps its secrets. Before seams close, warmed things slide in. A soapstone chip heated at the hearth and wrapped in scrap wool rides near your toes, so heat climbs the bedding from below. Another household prefers flat river pebbles warmed in water. Someone sprinkles powdered dried sea wrack, thought to keep damp smells down. A lice comb carved from bone hangs by the pillow thong. A quick pass before lying down slows midnight itches and, more importantly, gives anxious fingers something repetitive to do while stories start. Breathing games help too. Count slow between fire crackles, or trace the carved rune line with your thumb until you forget to finish and simply sleep. You help re-stuff one pillow and feel something papery. Birch bark scraped thin and rolled. Uncoiled. It shows a quick sketch of a branching figure with 3 dotted tips, a pocket world tree not unlike the soot drawing over the hearth. Mini diagrams like these show how myth seeps into bedding. You carry the tree where your dreams begin. If a loved one travels, a strip of bark marked with the same 3 dots can ride with them. So sleepers in 2 harbors rest under one tree. An intimacy sagas rarely document, but that fits the way families scattered by sea stay connected. Because winter nights are long, people talk lying down. Across the hall, 2 cousins compare which rune or herb eases nightmares. One swears by mugwort tied at the wrist. Another says whispering a short verse to Thor calms children faster than any plant. A visiting trader claims a small cross sewn under the seam works better still, and no one objects to using all 3. In later Christian centuries, little folded parchment prayers join the mix. Northern spirituality layers like bedding, plant, rune, saint, joke. Whatever helps a tired mind drop. Mainstream fact, runic writing occurs widely across the Norse world. Not only on monumental stones, but on everyday wood and bone objects. Famously, the large brigand corpus, showing that ordinary people used short inscriptions in domestic and commercial life. Quirky tidbit, aromatic plants including sweet gale, bog myrtle, angelica, juniper, and mugwort appear in northern environmental samples and folk records and could be tucked into bedding as comfort. Insect discourager, charm, or all 3. Mixed keepsakes like amber beads or iron bits sewn into textiles echo this habit. Historians still argue whether small stitched bundles recovered near head areas in some graves were sleep sachets. medicinal packets, status ornaments, or later disturbance. Interpretation drifts like smoke in a drafty roof. You knot the seam closed, press the pillow to your face, and breathe sharp green drifting into warm wool. Around you others settle their own rune-marked, herb-filled bundles. When night folds back in, you will lie among a whole row of personal dream borders, tiny stitched statements that say, in whatever language wood and leaf can manage, may your sleep be watched. Hearth coals slump low, and the hall tilts toward breathing time. Someone with soot-striped hands stoops beside the trench and lays a tight twist of dried juniper over a pocket of red. Then another bundle braided from sweet gale stems, then thin curls of birch bark that catch with a shy blue flame and sigh fragrant smoke into the dark. You roll onto an elbow, nose first. That sharp green pillow seam from earlier finds its echo in the air itself as the whole room receives a slow herbal rinse. Winter households across the north smoked things on purpose. Meat in dedicated sheds, yes, but also living rooms, storerooms, beds, clothing, anything that needed drying, scenting, discouraging insects, or masking old fish. Juniper especially turns up in ethnobotanical notes from Scandinavia, Iceland, and the Faroes as a favored fumigant. Toss it on embers, and its resin snaps aromatic sparks that drift deep into wool. Birch bark lights fast and carries a sweet paper smell. Sweet gale, bog myrtle, adds a bitter marsh note people long associated with brewing and insect shooing. When snow has locked you indoors for weeks, variety in scent is a moral victory. Your host lifts a skin bag and sprinkles crushed herbs through fingers the way modern cooks salt soup. Sparks chase them, releasing new waves. Children rattle their pillow charms so smoke can find the runes. Whether smoke truly targets carved marks is science for another century. But turning fumigation into a game ensures that betting actually gets aired. Practical trick disguised as magic, an ancient parenting technology. Watch the currents. Because the hearth trench lies lower than the sleep platforms, warm air rises toward rafters, bends below the smoke hole, and brushes every hanging cloak on the way. Someone unhooks fur boots and dangles them sole down for a quick de-dampening. Another fluffs a wadmal blanket so smoke runs through it like water through reeds. Experimental reconstructions show that even simple smoke exposure can deter lice and mites for a bit. Whether juniper beats birch in efficiency depends on resin load and enthusiasm of the tossers. Archaeologists still argue how intentional household fumigation was in the Viking Age versus being a side effect of constant fire. Residue patterns in roof planks say smoky, but purpose is harder to prove without recipe texts. Myth loves smoke. Storytellers fold scent into travel. Juniper carried by night wind might mark where land spirits hold counsel. Thin white threads creeping along rafters become breath from creatures roosting high in Yggdrasil's limbs. A blue wisp slipping the smoke hole hints that gossiping Ratatosker has launched with your secrets. A mother near you makes a ladder of her fingers, each knuckle a world. Smoke climbs it as she hums a verse about carrying good dreams up, bringing light back down. The baby who hears it may never learn the philosophy, but memory will tag that smell to safety. A low tray of embers gets walked around the hall to chase damp corners. This portable brazier routine shows up in later northern folk practice. Glowing pans carried beneath beds and into granaries, often with fragrant twigs, served both heating and symbolic cleansing roles. Your guide waves smoke under a hanging net, over carved bedposts, and through the doorway that separates people from the animal end. Drafts pull streams sideways. You taste resin and salt, peat ghost and wool grease, all folded into a sleepy blend, better than any store candle claiming Nordic night. Someone jokes that if Juniper truly drove away all mischief, the winter would be boring. Better to leave a crack for kind visitors from the unseen side. To demonstrate good manners, a tiny doll of bark and wool, 2 knots for eyes, gets propped by the door beam in the smoke, as if receiving first share. Quirky, yes, yet household tokens like butter dabs, carved gateposts, or doll stand-ins are recorded in later Scandinavian custom to keep Veturnætr, land spirits, content. It takes little imagination to slide such practice back in time as a bedtime reassurance. You test your own breathing, inhale as smoke thickens, exhale as it thins. Someone coaching a restless child counts juniper pops instead of sheep. Another arranges 3 herb twists in a row, juniper for warmth, sweet gale for clear dreams, birch for dawn light, and promises that if you smell birch first thing tomorrow, the sun will find a gap in clouds. Seasonal weather science? Maybe coincidence. Maybe parents gently reframing gray days so kids still hope. Evidence for deliberate dream fumigation, burning specific plants to shape what sleepers see, is thin for the Viking Age. Later folk magic instructions mention juniper, mugwort, and birch in context of protection, blessing, and clearing. But linking plant to dream content draws from scattered, often much later sources. Historians still argue whether sagas underreport household ritual, or whether we moderns overread scraps because we love the idea of Viking aromatherapy. Between scant texts and deep living tradition, the truth likely lies smoky and mixed. Gradually the hall darkens, herbs spent, only peat and charcoal glow. Smoke thins to a silver veil under the beams, then drains up and out so stars replace the haze. Your pillow holds new scent. Your hair will carry juniper all night, and your thoughts, softened by counting rising spirals, are ready to ride the storyteller's next turn down to ships and wave-rocked sleep, because not every night in the north ends under a roof. Mainstream fact: juniper wood and berries, birch bark, and bog myrtle, sweet gale, all appear in northern ethnobotanical records as burnable aromatics used for fumigation, scenting interiors, and discouraging insects. Household smoke exposure was unavoidable in longhouses and likely leveraged for drying and preservation. Quirky tidbit: portable ember trays waved under bedding or offered to small household tokens echo later. Scandinavian practices of smoking spaces for blessing or pest control and fit bedtime play rituals like "let the smoke find the runes." Historians still argue whether specific dream-shaping smokes were common in the Viking Age or largely later folk magic projected backward. Material residue alone cannot settle intention. Later, as juniper fades and stories thin, a trader who has wintered in more harbors than you can name tips his cup and says, "You haven't really learned to sleep northern until you've tried it on open water." At once, half the hall insists they sleep better on steady earth. The other half laughs, because summer voyages mean weeks when your bed is whatever the ship's crew can rig from sail, rope, and the stubborn human desire to nap between swells. You follow the trader's voice out through memory to the strand, where hauled hulls wait under rime, and from there into the rolling dark. Picture the lean, long ship, carved prow lifted like a watching beast, light, shallow, built for speed and raids and quick coastal hops. Crews on such craft do not expect luxury. Planked decks between thwarts serve for sitting, rowing, and, when oars are shipped and sail drawn, collapsing in cloaks. Broader cargo vessels, the Nar-type hulls that carry trade goods, animals, and travelers, offer a touch more beam and freeboard, so bundles can be stowed central and sleepers wedge themselves along gunnels or behind cargo mounds. Excavated ships at Gokstad, Oseberg, and the Skuldelev finds reveal construction, clinker planks, crossbeams, mast steps, removable deck planks that leaves no built bunks. Seafarers may do with loose gear, sea chests, sailcloth, and nerve. When weather permitted, crews likely beached or anchored close and slept ashore. Yet crossings demanded rest afloat. And that is where improvisation blooms. The trader shows how a rolled sail becomes half a tent, half a duvet. Lower sail, reef tight. Sling the bundle over a boom spar or prop with spare oars to make a windbreak. Crawl beneath with cloak and wool cap, and you've built the North Atlantic's least reliable bedroom, drafty, damp, and unforgettable. Tarred wool smells of pine pitch and salt. The cloth still radiates sun heat if taken down late. Some crews line the lee side with spare shields to block spray. In museum reconstructions, you can see peg holes and fittings that would easily support such barricades. What about hammocks, you ask, because later Age of Sail images haunt modern minds. He grins. True woven hammocks are not Norse kit. Those spread widely in Europe after contact with the Americas. Yet sailors will try anything once. Reenactment crews sometimes lash netting between thwarts for short dozes when hulls pound. The trader says he has seen rope cradles rigged from sail reef lines to keep a fevered man from rolling. Whether Viking Age crews did the same is unproven. Sagas stay quiet. Archaeology offers no knots that say, "Swing me." Historians still argue about at-sea sleep practice. Did ships routinely beach nightly? Did crews rotate standing watch so most could lie flat? Did only the off-watch curl under shields while the rest bailed and steered? Evidence is splashy, incomplete, and salt-eaten. What we do know, a sea chest doubled as stool, table, and pillow. Iron banding survives in wrecks. Put the broadside down and lean. Wedge your boots beneath a thwart, and you will not slide as the hull lifts. Many travelers carried stuffed sacks, straw, feathers if rich, spare clothing if not, that served on land and aboard alike. Oilskins or leather wraps kept fills drier. One crew you meet imagines better. They stitch short loops to the corners of travel quilts so the cloth can be toggled to rail pegs. Suddenly, your blanket stays where you left it when the ship heels. Practical genius born of wet nights. Sleep has rhythm at sea. Oars thump. Rigging creaks. Hull planks knock. Once you match breath to waves, the motion rocks you. Crews turn that pulse into lullaby. A low call begins near the mast. One line praising the good wind. A murmur answers from stern. Then a verse about wolves on shore, goats at home, or gods who hate seasick sailors. Children aboard coastal shuttles learn counting swells long before counting sheep. Every 6th wave big, every 12th special. Hold your breath and wish. You lie on your cloak, cheek to deck plank, and feel the swell pattern under bone. When the trader sings, he times each phrase to the boat's slow lift, so vowels lengthen on the rise and close on the settle. Even if you do not know the words, your inner ear obeys. Spray happens. A spare hood or seal skin over your face keeps salt off while you drowse. In calmer stretches, crew raise an awning from mast to stern post using spare yards and stretched sailcloth. Under it, lantern light tosses gold ripples on tar and wet hair. That flicker, firelight out of place on water, becomes its own charm. If flame holds, weather holds. Quirky mariner lore claims that turning a cup upside down beside your head while sleeping invites calm seas. Because the ocean, seeing a container that cannot be filled, feels politely refused. Superstition? Maybe. But many a deck shows a line of inverted cups at night. Evidence for long open sea voyages is strong. Norse craft reached Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. So some portion of crew rest had to occur aboard. Sleep quality on a rolling clinker hull is no joke. Experiments with replica ships like the Sea Stallion from Glendalough show crews napping in oilskins wedged among gear, catching minutes at a time between sail handling. You mimic their trick. Knees braced, back to cargo, cloak overhead, not luxury. Yet the steady thunk of waves and hiss along planks becomes white noise. No worse than communal snoring back in the hall. Mainstream fact. Viking Age seafaring used open-decked longships and broader cargo gnar, with no built sleeping quarters. Crews rested on deck under sailcloth, shields, or ashore when possible, as evidenced by ship finds, Gokstad, Skuldalev, and Saga travel accounts. Quirky tidbit. Mariners improvise, rolled sails as windbreak quilts, inverted cups for good weather, and reenactor rope cradles echo the urge to invent hammocks at sea, even where historical proof is thin. Historians still argue how often voyages push through night versus beaching, and what formal watch-sleep rotations looked like on different ship types. Sources are fragmentary and regionally variable. You close your eyes to the roll, letting wave lift become a cradle stroke. Tar, salt, wet wool, lantern glow through sailcloth, sea lullabies all carry you until gulls and a change in hull pitch hint landfall and the next round of charms waiting ashore. The ship's slow roll follows you back ashore. Even under the longhouse roof, the sway keeps moving behind your ribs. Ember lights seeming to rise and fall against the posts as if the whole hall floats at anchor. The Skald notices you steadying your cup, lays his carved staff across two low milking stools like a loom beam, and whispers that some powers are too large for one room. So the women who mine the strands of fate borrow rhythm from sea swell, hearth smoke, dripping melt and the tiny twitch of breath at your nose. Lie back, he says, and feel the motion carry yarn. Story-light thickens. 3 quiet shapes gather where shadow and smoke meet. One crouches by the door where snow melt seeps. She dips fingers in the damp and twists cold sparkles into a length that smells of soil and memory. The before, the roots that hold you. Another stands over the hearth trench where juniper still ghosts the air. She plucks ember glow and wool warmth, spinning what happens now, the living strand brushing your cheek. High in the rafters near the roof gap sits a third. She catches star flecks drifting through the louvre and draws a pale line toward tomorrow. Whether you call them Urd, Verdandi, Skald, or simply the patient women, they work while you drowse. A loose end taps your sleeve. Children reach to pinch it and dump real tools in your lap. A spindle whirl scored like a wheel, a bone needle, a twist of fleece. Excavations across the Norse world turn up whirls by the basketful. Stone, clay, bone, even lead. Evidence that spinning was constant labor. Clothing, sail cord, fishing nets, bedding ties, and ship rig lashings all began between fingers. When people who spent hours a day twisting fiber heard poems about cosmic weaving, the leap from wool to world was short. You try drafting a lock, it breaks. The hall laughs kindly. Knots matter. In later Scandinavian, folk custom threads were tied while naming a wish or protective verse, then tucked beneath pillows until morning. Other traditions looped red yarn above cradles or around cow tails on festival eves so luck would not wander. Sliding such gestures backward is informed imagination. Yet textile tools saturated daily life so thoroughly that small ritual uses almost certainly rode beside work. Quirky household habits. An extra twist for a traveling son. A green loop for safe lambing. A braid hung where children sleep. Fit the culture's comfort logic even when archaeology stays quiet. The Skald moistens thumb and forefinger, twists 3 scrap yarns, peat brown, frost white, ember red, and lets the soft braid drape across your knees. Feel the difference. Rough wool grips, linen slides, horsehair added for strength can cut if pulled too hard. Fate, he murmurs. Maybe woven, braided, knotted, carved, or simply laid out parallel, depending on whose telling you trust. Some verses picture patient women carving runes in wood. Others stretch web on a frame. Others measure lengths to be clipped. Scholars still argue whether these images reflect one shared belief, several local imaginations, or poets reaching for any craft metaphor listeners would feel in their hands. You tip your head and let smoky rafters turn into warped beams. Each rib becomes a year, each peg a season when ships returned, when juniper smoked, when lambs bleated new wool. The deck roll you carried inland becomes the shuttle pass. Inhale as memory slides one way. Exhale as possibility slides back. Congratulations. You have invented breath weaving, a bedtime rhythm any winter household could teach without parchment. Count 10 passes and see if your shoulders drop. Count the next 10 and notice how noise in your head begins to card out smooth. Talk ripples like carded fleece. One uncle says threads tangle, and that is why lives snarl. Another says you can comb them smooth if you start before dusk. A grandmother replies that if you comb too hard, you only make rope and must tow it yourself. Laughter lifts smoke. Theology collapses into chores when fate is explained in fleece weight and not tightness. Practical wisdom travels farther in dark months than formal doctrine, especially when children are supposed to be falling asleep. Near the door, an older woman settles with her distaff wrapped in gray. She drafts fibers so fine they vanish in the gloom. Dream weight, she calls it. She spins a yard of almost nothing, wraps it twice around your wrist, and tucks the tail beneath itself. If the loop remains come morning, she says. The patient women at the roots remembered you. If it slips free, they were busy and will return tomorrow. Evidence that Viking Age households tested dreams with wrist loops is thin. A few graves preserve thread near hands, but purpose is uncertain, and later folk tales may be coloring memory. Still, the bracelet warms quickly, and belief is half the blanket. Mainstream fact: Norse mythic literature, poems later written in the collection now called the Poetic Edda and Snorri's prose account, speaks of fate beings, Nornir, often named Urd, Verdandi, Skuld, tending a well beneath the world tree and shaping destinies. Spinning or measuring imagery recurs and matches the abundance of spindle whorls and loom weights excavated across Norse lands, underscoring how central fiber work was. Quirky tidbit: later Scandinavian folk practiced ties wishes or protections into knotted thread beneath pillows or over cradles, a habit easy to imagine echoing older bed charms. Historians still argue how widely ordinary Viking Age households conceived a three Norn model versus many local fate spirits, and how literally textile metaphors were understood beyond poetic circles. The yarn warms to your pulse under the fur edge. Above, wind rattles the louvre like beads sliding on a loom rod. You breathe with the pass of imaginary shuttles until thought thins to thread, and sleep begins to weave itself closed around you. Your yarn bracelet still warms your wrist when a draft nips your toes. Someone mutters that the land spirits are checking the door seam, and a ripple of sleepy agreement moves down the hall. You slide from your bedding, careful not to wake the dog, and pad toward the threshold where outside chill seeps in a silver line across the floorboard. There, tucked between jam and turf wall, stand the guardians you kept glimpsing in passing. Thumb-high carved posts, soot dark at the tips. A shallow wooden saucer slicked with yesterday's butter, and a barked doll you saw smoked earlier, now propped upright like a guest too polite to sit. Welcome to the night shift. Those invisible neighbors northern households coaxed, placated, or simply acknowledged so everyone, seen and unseen, could sleep in peace. Doorways in cold climates matter. They leak heat and luck. Many Scandinavian farm sites show stout door frames, lintel beams, and sometimes decorative posts or animal heads mounted near entries. Whether a given carving housed a spirit is impossible to read in the ground. Yet written sources preserve a lively vocabulary of beings tied to place. Landvettir, land spirits. Husvettir, house spirits. Alfar, elves. Later farm sprites like the Nisse or Tomte. Law texts in medieval Iceland even require ship captains to remove or mask fearsome figureheads before landfall lest they frighten the country's protective land spirits. A practical legal echo of belief that unseen guardians notice what approaches. That rule alone tells you threshold etiquette scaled all the way up to national shoreline. Closer to sleep scale, households leave tokens. Your host takes a hazel splinter, dips it in melting tallow, and touches each carved post, a dot of fat to keep faces bright. Children scrape a pea of butter from the shared dish and smear it on the bark doll's chin. If it's gone by morning, the spirits came hungry. And if not, the dog had a fine night snack. Either way, the tale works. Later folklore across Scandinavia brims with offerings of butter. Porridge or ale to small domestic sprites who guard barns and beds. Sliding that habit earlier than the written tales is reasonable, though unproven. Quirky side practice. Some farms lay out the very first ladle of winter brew for the unseen. Others flip a stool upside down so hidden guests can rest. Still others tuck miniature bread crusts into wall cracks for the little ones who dislike smoke. You watch as a crust, char on one edge, vanishes into a chink. Whether eaten by mouse or myth hardly matters when the goal is children who feel watched over. Because the North names many beings, categories blur. Are elves the same as land spirits? Do ancestor dead become house guardians? Do Christian house blessings simply rebrand older courtyard rites? Scholars working through saga references, place names, Alf Fields, Vetter Hollows, and later folklore disagree. The private autumn rite called Alfa Blot, elf offering, mentioned in Skald Sigvat's travel poem, suggests small, household-led ceremonies outsiders could not join. Some interpret this as an ancestor feast. Others see offerings to land spirits or local powers. Archaeological correlates are thin. Scattered animal bone deposits near farm boundaries. Odd miniature vessels, post replacements burned then reset. Historians still argue how much continuity connects early Alfar language to later friendly barn sprites, leaving straw plates in horses' manes. Bedtime simply folds all guests together under one blanket. Threshold markers persist because they're easy. In one corner hangs a carved horse head, finial blackened by smoke. In Icelandic lore imported in later centuries, dragon or beast prows had to be removed when nearing shore, scaled down. Families sometimes detachable hung fierce heads, by doors only in rough weather so local spirits knew the racket was friendly. Your hall's guardian posts show drilled eyes once set with resin beads. Tonight the beads are out, but lamplight pools in the hollows like watchful pupils. A child loops red yarn, leftover from fate weaving, around both posts and ties 3 lazy knots. Not sealing the night? Maybe. More practically, the yarn reminds late arrivals to step high so snow does not sweep the butter offering away. You kneel and breathe close. Resin, smoke, a whisper of old milk fat. Peat damp edging in from the yard. That is the smell of doors that do not slam, because slamming insults neighbors. A grandmother instructs. Always enter with good words. Never kick the sill. Share first steam with those who live in cracks. The rule is half politeness to spirits, halfway to keep muddy boots from breaking thresholds that took weeks to carve. Everyday etiquette masquerading as myth is a repeating northern theme. If a story gets children to close doors gently, fuel lasts longer. Along interior posts hang tiny fabric flags, triangle scraps cut from worn tunics. On red, someone chalked a simple hammer shape. On green, a tree. On white, a cross. On undyed cloth, nothing but grease thumbprints. This hall has traveled religious change and sees no reason to choose one guardian when many might help. Bedside pedagogy. Whichever symbol you point at before sleep, you speak its short line. Hammer guard us. Tree hold us. Peace keep us. Then blow the lamp. The act steadies breath, frames night, and threads belief through habit. Material traces that match every story are rare. Carved doorposts rot. Butter fails to fossilize, and bark dolls feed mice long before archaeologists arrive. What does endure are law hints, mask the ship prow. Saga glimpses of private cults, later ethnographic records of household sprites, and the sheer number of threshold place names invoking beings beyond human occupants. Combined, they sketch a culture where people recognize that land, house, ancestor, and story all had stakes in how you crossed a door, and by extension, how you lay down safe within it. You dab a fingertip in the butter saucer and make a tiny mark beside the others. No thunder, no flash, just the mild satisfaction of having greeted whoever shares the cracking turf wall with you. Back at your bedding, the draft seems smaller, or maybe you simply mind it less now that the door has friends. Dogs sigh, embers dim, and the hall settles into that held-together feeling shared guardians bring. Mainstream fact: medieval Icelandic law required ships to remove or cover fearsome figureheads on approach so as not to disturb protective land spirits, showing belief in territorial beings tied to place. Norse texts and later tradition attest to Landvættir, Alfar, and other localized spirits associated with farms and thresholds. Quirky tidbit: butter smears, porridge bowls, flipped stools, and tiny carved posts appear in later Scandinavian household sprite customs and plausibly echo older northern practices of feeding unseen neighbors at doors and barns. Historians still argue the relationships among Alfar, land spirits, ancestors, and later barn sprites, Nisse, Tomte, and how directly medieval rites like alfablot map onto such domestic gestures. You crawl back under furs with butter scent faint on your hand. If unseen neighbors approve, perhaps dreams will pass quietly, and even drafts behave like gentle breezes from friendly lands. You wake to the soft clink of things that are not cookware. Above your head, a braided wool thong runs from roof beam to roof beam, and from it hangs a scatter of tiny objects catching ember light the way frost catches dawn. Because you were polite to the doorway guardians before sleep, you're invited to help restring tonight's Dreamwatch line. The mixed little protections this hall trusts when long dark presses close. First comes amber. In a shallow soapstone bowl lie trade chips hauled up sea roads that tied the Baltic to these fjords. Clear honey drops, cloudy butterscotch lumps with tiny insect ghosts. One reddish shard dark as smoked salmon skin. Finds from market towns like Hedeby and from burials across Norway, Denmark, And the islands show amber traveled widely in the Viking Age. Drilled beads, pendants, and inlay flecks survive where wool and wood long since vanished. Hold a chip to the coals, and it glows like a banked sun. Rub it, and it will pull chaff, static that feels just magical enough that someone jokes the piece can catch bad dreams the way it catches straw. 3 amber bits go on the cord above where you'll sleep. Next comes iron, bent boat nails, ring rivets, a broken awl tip wrapped in scrap cloth so it won't scratch foreheads if the line swings. Iron carries boundary reputation in northern lore. Later farm tales say barn sprites step careful around cold iron, and travelers still tuck a nail in pocket seams, just in case. Whether that caution reaches straight back to the Viking Age or ripened later is hard to prove. Yet, hedging costs nothing, and forged odds and ends are everywhere. So a nail gets tied pointing toward the drafty seam, a rivet toward the smoke hole, an awl fragment between the children who pretend it's a tiny spear that guards both. Then claws. A brown tuft with a hooked keratin cap proves to be a bear claw sheath saved from the season a hive was raided upriver. Beside it hangs an eagle talon tip traded for fish oil. Another household adds a slice of boar tusk drilled for thong. Animal power by proxy. Sleep under claw, wake brave. Boasts an uncle who clearly never wrestled a whole bear. Faunal finds in Norse graves include teeth, claws, and bones drilled or grooved for suspension. Whether trophies, charms, status markers, hunting tags, or all 3 blended, we cannot always tell. Yet here they sway as bedside backbone. Between the heavier bits ride soft fillers, a goose feather brushed with plant indigo, a twist of blue tablet weave rescued from a worn cloak, a reindeer bell tongue that lost its shell and now only ticks wood on wood, and a thin chip of whalebone scratched with 3 converging lines, the household shorthand for the world tree you climbed in story earlier. When the hearth breathes heat, the whole strand moves like slow wind chimes without much sound. Iron taps amber. Bell tongue kisses claw. Rhythm settles in the dark the way surf set its pulse in you at sea. Spacing matters. There's a joking rule. If charms tangle, you'll dream snarled nets. If they hang clear, tomorrow's voyage, even if only to the woodpile, glides smooth. Another sleeper swears by 3, 3, and 1. 3 warm comforts, amber, feather, wool. 3 hard guards, iron, claw, tusk. And 1 surprise spirits must pause to inspect, buying you time to drift off. Tonight the surprise is a postage scrap of tar-scented sailcloth tied near your brow so you can, someone says, sleep like a nar in harbor, not a goat in wind. Practicality hides inside the magic. Suspending small pieces keeps them from vanishing in bedding, lets damp dry in the ceiling draft, and reminds you to mend gear before it rusts or molds. Amber near warmth releases faint pine. Iron overhead nudges tomorrow's nail straightening. The bare claw sparks retellings of the beehive raid. Buying another half hour of laughter before lights drop. In summer, the same cord air dries fish hooks and sewing needles. Protection, storage, conversation pegboard, domestic multi-tool disguised as charm strand. Archaeology gives crumbs that tempt scenes like this. Amber beads cluster near head and chest in some Viking Age graves. Iron nails, rivets, and bent tacks show up in foundation and fill deposits. Animal claws drilled for suspension turn up from Scandinavia to Norse-influenced sites abroad. Little bells and capsule fittings cling to mineralized textile knots where headgear once lay. Sorting purpose is harder. Were they worn jewelry, trade wealth, trophies, ritual deposits, children's toys, or bed space guardians? Contexts are mixed. Peat collapses shuffle finds, meaning drifts like smoke. A favorite anecdote traveling with merchants from Greenland tells of a collapsed turf roof layer where excavators lifted a corrosion lump holding an iron nail. Bird bone, amber chip, and thread ghosts fused in rust. The catalog labeled it mixed debris. Reenactors call it night bundle. Evidence or coincidence? It reminds you that small things migrate upward and meet in rafters, exactly where tonight's line hangs. At last the cord is lifted and hooked to pegs, so it droops in a shallow arc over the sleeping row, like an indoor horizon. Ember glow pours through amber drops and paints honey stripes across blankets. Iron nods dull red. The bear claw's curve throws a crescent shadow. The little bell tongue ticks when drafts nudge it, marking breaths. You lie back beneath the slow mobile and count. Amber, iron, claw, feather, bell, repeat, until counts blur to hum and hum to nothing. Mainstream fact, Baltic amber circulated widely through Viking Age trade networks and appears in graves and settlements across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. Iron hardware was ubiquitous. And animal teeth or claws drilled for suspension are documented as amulets or adornments in Norse contexts. Quirky tidbit: household protective bundles combining iron scraps. Animal bits, herbs, and textile pieces hang near beds and cradles in later Scandinavian folk practice, echoing tonight's Dream Watch line. Historians still argue how to read small mixed object clusters in archaeological records, residual trash, status display, ritual deposit, or intimate sleep charms strung much like this one. Midwinter settles deep enough that day is mostly rumor. Outside the turf walls, wine scrapes dry snow across packed yards. But inside the Longhouse tonight, everything glows fuller. Lamps trimmed high, embers banked long, because neighbors have walked, sledded, skied, or skated over frozen inlets to share the season's offering feast. You wake to clatter and warm voices. Bedding has been rolled against the walls to clear floor space. Animals shift in the byre end. As much audience as insulation. The air is thick with malt steam, roast fat, wet wool, juniper ghost from last night's smoke, and fresh fir green strewn to sweeten the boards. Midwinter company means you will not sleep straight through. Instead, you'll drift in and out as the hall cycles food, toasts, song, and drowsy collapse in waves. Someone sets a low table, a broad board on trestles, down the hearth center. Platters arrive, barley loaves stamped with small sun marks, a red stew whose color you politely label iron rich without asking details. Salt fish flaked into butter, dried berries thawed in warm whey, and the season's showpiece. A boar's head glazed dark, tusks polished, apple wedged not for drama, but to hold the jaw open while cooking. In later descriptions of Yule across Scandinavia and the Anglo-Scandinavian world, a ceremonial Yule boar, or loaf shaped like one, receives oaths and toasts. Whether every Viking Age farm produced a full tusked beast or scaled symbol to budget is unknown. Yet a snout of some sort almost always appears in the stories told tonight. Children stroke the bristles for luck before slices go out. You do too, because no one declines extra luck in midwinter. Drinking rounds begin. A horn fills, is lifted, and passed. First toast, to the powers who keep light on its long, slow return. Some say gods by name, others murmur, those who guard roof and field. And at least one offers to whoever gets us through lambing. Second toast, to the honored dead, parents, shipmates, kin. Names braided with memories that make listeners laugh, sniff, or nod toward the door where carved guardian posts watch. Third toast, to vows. Quiet promises to finish a boat plank, mend a feud, survive the next voyage. This three-toast rhythm echoes descriptions of sumbul, drinking ceremony, preserved in saga and later medieval texts. A formal sequence of drinks with invocations and oaths, often tied to feasts and seasonal markers. Your host softens formality by turning the oath round into bedtime wishes. Sleep warm, dream of green hay, wake to longer days. Heat builds, garments shed, embers stirred flare shadows high. Children doze across laps. Someone eases a goat kid indoors because its bleat will not stop and the byre end is crowded anyway. Mixed sleeping with animals is no shock in cold seasons. Warmth is warmth. Excavations at some Norse farmsteads show arrangements where human living spaces adjoin or partially share air with livestock bays. In harsher zones, cohabitation conserved heat. Whether tonight's crowding is holiday overflow or normal winter strategy, you tuck your feet between a dog and the haysack barrier and approve the arrangement. Between courses, soft rituals repeat. A sprig of fir dipped in ale flicks tiny drops along the hearthstones and over door lintels. A cleansing splash practiced in later folk custom and plausible in earlier seasonal rites. Someone presses the boar's tusk end to the threshold posts so the land spirits taste feast smoke. Butter already there shines brighter. A guest from inland ties a thin braid of red yarn around the staff planted last night for the World Tree story, and says that roots drink deep at midwinter. If you water them with ale, they repay by holding roofs through storm. Myth, metaphor, and maintenance blend seamlessly when rafters creak over heads you love. Feast spacing around sleep becomes choreography. Not everyone stays upright, start to finish. Instead, people rotate. One group eats, while another group naps by the animal warmth. Children curl under benches. Travelers who hauled sleds take early beds, while hosts pour last cups. The hall never fully sleeps, the way a big city never fully goes dark, but drowses and pulses time to coals and cups. You drift off after a toast, wake to low verse, drift again as someone retells how last year's sled broke and everyone walked 20 nights of snow, each retelling shorter until it is only a sigh and a snore. Outside calendar lines blur, when exactly was midwinter for the Viking Age north. Written sources use multiple markers: earliest Yule feasts, Midwinter, midwinter sacrifice, Jule that later Christian calendars fixed near Christmas, and regional weather cues. Solar solstice falls in late December, but some reckonings place midwinter several weeks later, roughly halfway between first winter nights and first spring stirrings. Scholars still debate how to align saga terminology with astronomical dates, church feast adaptations, and local farming practice. Climate drift across Norway, Iceland, and the islands makes one tidy answer unlikely. Tonight your hosts celebrate when supplies, snow condition, and kin travel all say, gather, which may be the most human calendar of all. Quirky tidbit: before pledging, each guest lightly touches that boar bristle tuft still tied in the charm line overhead. A household twist said to tickle lies out of tongues. Does it work? A man hiccups and amends his vow from build 2 ships to patch 1. Laughter counts as truth serum. Mainstream fact: Norse and broader Scandinavian sources attest seasonal feasting and blot offerings in winter. Terms like Jol, Yule, Midwinter, and structured drinking ceremonies, sumbul, with toasts to deities, ancestors, and oaths appear in sagas and later accounts. Archaeological farm layouts support large indoor gatherings with adjacent animal spaces that could share warmth. Quirky tidbit: Yule boar traditions, real animal or symbolic loaf. Receiving vows and touches persist into later medieval and early modern custom and plausibly echo earlier practice. Flicking ale or beer across doorposts likewise appears in folk blessing rites. Historians still argue the exact dating of midwinter, the scale of sacrifice, and how uniformly sumbul structure was observed across regions and social ranks. Full, warm, ale loose. You recline with your back to a haystack while goat breath steams the air above and ember halos wobble in your vision. Outside wind scrapes the roof. Inside people sleep in loops. Eat, toast, doze, wake, stoke, whisper, repeat, until the long night finally thins. When it does, you will hear talk of divided sleeps and winter patterns, a rhythm already nudging your dreams. You surface from a heavy doze to find the hall dim and ember silver again. Ale steam has thinned. Goats mutter in their pen, and half the sleepers around you are sitting up while the rest still snore under pelts. Someone near the hearth whispers, between sleeps, pats a child's shoulder, and pours a little warm whey. Only then do you realize you've entered the wide northern pause that may lie between what later people would call a first sleep and a second. Long winter dark invites broken nights. When sunset crawls through mid-afternoon and dawn delays, the span in between stretches absurdly long. Bodies that heated quickly beneath layered furs often wake after several hours as the fire ebbs, bladders nudge, or a draft noses across toes. Rather than fight wakefulness, many households fold it into routine. Stir embers, check animals, whisper a verse. Mend a strap by lamp glow. Talk softly. Even step outside to read weather by stars. Medieval and early modern European court records, household letters, medical guides, and devotional writings from regions far south of these fjords mention lying down for a first sleep, rising for an hour or more to pray, warm, feed infants, or visit neighbors, then returning to bed. If people with shorter winter nights did this, imagine what the deep north might have done. You pull on boots and pad outside. Frost glaze crunches. Aurora smears a thin green wash behind the ridge, like breath from the world tree's crown. Two neighbors with shielded lanterns stride the rutted path toward another farm. Midnight visiting. Tracks between houses freeze hard enough to follow by feel. The interval is used to borrow live embers, share news, swap herbs, or check whether a calving cow needs watching. Community netting tightens when sun hours fail. Back inside, a mid-watch tray waits by the hearth, warm whey steaming in a lidded pot, a crock of barley porridge kept above coals, dried berries, and slivers of last night's boar. Eating lightly steadies mood before the second stretch. A grandmother leads 3 murmured lines while ladling. Thanks for the hours past. Blessing for the hours to come. Request that dreams stay kind. Later, Christian centuries will tuck short psalms into that slot. Earlier homes lean on simple charms. May embers hold. May roofs shed snow. May travelers find bright doors. She taps the ladle 3 times on the pot rim. So the good hear it, a sleepy liturgy children come to expect. The pause becomes private time. Grown-ups trade hushed talk, not meant for wide ears, grain stores, marriage prospects. Fence repairs owed when thaw comes, who snored, who spoke a name in dreams. Someone scratches runes on a wax tablet by lamplight. Account tallies before memory blurs. Another combs a child's hair for lice, because both are awake anyway. When daylight is rationed, night work creeps where it fits. Modern sleep historians studying pre-industrial sources note that these liminal intervals often produce vivid dream recall and creative problem solving. Your host swears the best boat ideas arrive at mid-watch when minds drift loose. Practical needs underpin the custom. Fires must be fed or banked. Snow sometimes scrapes roofs hard enough that people knock drifts free in the dark. Animals turned or watered sleep quieter, and so do you. Chamber pots fill. In ice-edge settlements, a drift-buried doorway can smother a hall. Rising halfway through the long dark to clear vents makes survival sense. Soil layers from some northern hearth excavations show repeated thin ash lifts nested through heavy winter deposits. Exactly what you'd expect if fires were tended in several short cycles rather than a single bedtime load. A stratigraphy whispering rise and rest, even when words are lost. A restless child receives a half-dream task. Count the charm strand overhead, amber, iron, claw, feather, touch each, breathe once, repeat until fingers forget to move. Another trick measures breath like waves from the sea voyage you remember. Inhale 3, hold 3, exhale 6. By the 4th cycle, lids sink. Quirky household science says, if you wake hot, you trade places with someone nearer the draft. If you wake cold, you scoot toward the embers before starting the count. Bed choreography keeps peace in tight quarters where elbows, dogs, and cousins all want the warm plank. Written hints ripple outward. An Icelandic medical note, centuries later, advises a short prayer and stretch if wakeful in the night. Monastic schedules across medieval Europe formalized rising for nocturnes, chanting offices before returning to cells. Early modern English legal depositions and diaries casually use the phrases first sleep and second sleep. None of those texts describe this specific coastal hall. Yet together they show that long pre-industrial nights frequently unfolded in 2 acts separated by a socially acceptable interval. Projecting backward to longer, darker winters in the far north is cautious but reasonable. When talk thins, you bank embers, a juniper twig for scent, a peat sod for slow burn, a pinch of salt rumored to keep sparks polite. One cousin ducks out to recheck roof drift. Another tops the water pot so morning porridge won't scorch. Your wrist yarn, spun earlier by the fate-wise elder, remains snug. She winks, claiming the watchers at the roots remembered you during the interval. You roll to face the door so any visiting spirit sees you are accounted for. The practical reason is to leave room for the dog. But layered meanings make better stories. Mainstream fact. Documentary evidence from pre-industrial Europe records segmented sleep. First sleep, a waking watch used for prayer, chores, or quiet talk. And a second sleep, in legal testimony, medical and devotional texts, and household correspondence. Extended winter darkness would naturally support similar rhythms in northern communities, though direct Viking Age descriptions are scarce. Quirky tidbit: mid-watch trays of warm drink, charm touch counting games, and ladle tap mini blessings help children and drowsy adults slide from the wake interval into the second stretch without worry. Historians still argue how widespread true biphasic sleep was in the Viking Age north, versus flexible wake and doze patterns shaped by weather, work, and household size. You settle again. Embers glow dull red through your lids. Breath counts fade, and somewhere between goat's sigh and roof, drip the long night refolds, stitching its 2 halves into one northern dream. Mid-watch slips toward its drowsy end. Yet a knot of travelers near the hearth still fidgets, minds racing, bellies full, bodies tired, but sleep refusing. So your host beckons a visiting wise woman toward the fire trench. She carries a slender iron-capped staff wrapped in dyed bands, its shaft worn smooth where fingers have traveled years. Small bronze rings at the grip chime when she sets it down. You've heard murmurs since dusk. She works Seder, the northern art of coaxing, seeing, bending chants of fingers' width. And tonight her task is humbler than storm calling. Guide worried people back toward dreams. She does not preach. She sits cross-legged, staff across her knees like a loom rod, and begins with breath, in through nose, out slow through parted lips, so the exhale sings a thread of tone over the coals. Others match her. Slow unison breath in a crowded room changes heat. You feel air draw and settle. From a pouch, she tips a pinch of powdered angelica and juniper onto a shard of hot stone. Scent lifts, familiar from bedding sachets, now tied to her rhythm. Association is medicine. The brain that smelled juniper at comfortable bedtime yesterday learns quickly to unclench when the same green note returns. Accounts preserved in later Icelandic texts. Erik's Saga Rauda gives a famous scene. Described traveling seeresses, volur, who mounted high seats, bore staves, wore bead-heavy cloaks, and sang vardlokur, spirit-locking or ward songs, while communities asked about weather, fate, and illness. Whatever the precise practice, staff, song, and communal focus recur. Archaeology adds weight. Several richly furnished female graves across the Norse world contain iron or wooden staves, some capped with bronze knobs or hooked ends. Scholars connect these with seer roles, though certainty eludes us. Tonight's woman mirrors that pattern stripped to bedtime scale. No platform, no court, just a winter hall, loose song, and anxious sleepers. She reaches the staff tip into ash and sketches a branching line that echoes the soot tree drawn nights ago. Roots, trunk, crown, remember? She whispers. Tie breath to root on inhale. Let worry drip down with meltwater on exhale. She taps each traveler's pillow seam where herbs hide. If your thoughts skitter, trace the seam until you smell juniper. Then count 3 sparks. Then let go. Behavioral sleep coaching by way of saga magic. Clever. A boy worries about his father away at sea. She unthreads a hair from her braid, knots it around a sliver of driftwood, and plants the sliver upright in the bedding between boy and hearth. A tiny mast. Waves know where masts belong, she says. They will roll him toward us while you sleep. Quirky, entirely. Yet tucking symbolic travel pieces at bedside is cheap comfort, and small carved ship tokens appear in graves from Norway to the Isles. Whether placed for journey in death or memory in life, people used ship miniatures to hold distance close. Converting the idea to a child's dream anchor fits the culture's imagination. She moves the staff in shallow arcs over foreheads without touching, close enough that the iron cap warms in reflected heat, close enough that rings chime. Some later Christian blessing gestures will look similar. Tonight's predates that overlay or merges with it, depending whom you ask. One traveler requests a dream of home fields. She tells him to roll so his head points the way those fields lie. Compass alignment for dreams is widespread folklore. Face east for sun, north for wisdom, homeward for safe return. And while we lack direct Viking Age manuals prescribing sleep direction, graves aligned by custom and house doors oriented to light show people cared where bodies pointed. Historians still argue whether directional sleeping held specific spiritual charge in Norse practice, or if later folk habit colors memory. Your pillow pivot costs nothing, so you try it. Noise drains from the hall. Her tone lowers until you feel rather than hear it. She layers words under breath. Names of winds, of calm fjords, of wool tasks done, of lambs yet unborn. Prosaic comforts ride beside conjured ones because brains relax fastest when tomorrow's chores sound manageable. She threads in a myth line. Freya's falcon cloak folding over wide lands. Whoever wears it sees far. So if your dreams borrow a feather, maybe news of distant kin will glide in by morning. A girl clutches her amber bead, hewn sunlight. Freya's tears, trade coin. All 3 stories attached to amber in later poetic tradition. And bead to brow contact is a bedtime technique older than any saga. Cedar's social edges show even in this hush. Later prose sources written by Christian authors note that men who practiced Seder risked reputations for ergi, unmanly softness. suggesting gendered boundaries around certain ritual roles. Yet saga episodes also show powerful male figures engaging Seer when need overrode norms. Were domestic dream rites lighter and therefore broadly acceptable? Did households quietly adapt techniques from formal ritual without naming them? Scholars debate where performance ended and private care began. How much trance, divination, healing, or social theater each gathering held, and whether staff equals distaff, linking magic to women's fiber work. Interpretations branch like the world tree itself. No single answer holds all rings. You borrow her breath count. In 4, hold a bead of ember glow. Out 6, watching smoke bend. Repeat. The iron cap traces a circle over your pillow. Juniper ghosts. Outside wind blunts. In your palm she sets 3 husks. Barley, fir cone scale, fishbone chip, and tells you to choose which road your dream walks. Land, forest, sea. You close fingers around all 3, because why limit yourself? She grins. Greedy dreams travel farthest. Mainstream fact, literary sources asked. Eirik's Saga Rauda, other sagas, and Snorri's accounts describe Seer's volur performing Seer with staffs, songs, and communal consultation. Archaeological female graves containing staff-like rods bolster the association with ritual specialists across the Norse world. Quirky tidbit. Households adapt big rites into small comforts, tying symbolic travel tokens, ship slivers, orienting pillows homeward, scent triggering relaxation with herbs used in bedding. Practices echoed in later Scandinavian folk sleep charms. Historians still argue what Seer encompassed: prophecy, trance, healing, weather, social theater, the extent of gender restriction, and whether dream work formed a routine domestic subset or a saga-shaped embellishment. You cradle the barley fur fish bundle against warm straw, match her slow tone, and feel the restless knot behind your ribs loose. Somewhere between iron ring chime and juniper breath, your second sleep finally gathers, sliding you down roots toward whatever dream road you gripped. By the time second sleep has taken most of the hall, the fire has slumped to a low red trench, and shadows from roof beams stripe the side platforms like tall forest trunks. You shift, reach to brace a hand against the nearest upright, and under your fingers feel shallow cuts. Straight strokes crossing, leaning, branching. When you lean closer, ember light shows more. A short ladder mark, a fork, a triangle, a tree-like flare. Are these carpenter's layout lines? Game scratched during long winters? Family marks of ownership? Or something meant to watch over sleepers? Welcome to the puzzle of bedpost runes. Wood rarely lasts 1,000 northern years. So much of what we know about carved marks comes from places where timber survived, waterlogged, charred, or frozen, or from later folk furniture that likely inherits older habits. Posts from excavated houses occasionally show scored tally lines. Stave church doors preserve complex incisions. Farm chests in open-air museums bristle with symbols cut by generations who never planned to be studied. Short runic inscriptions on movable objects, sticks, knife handles, combs, prove that anyone with a blade could cut letters, names, jokes, or charms into wood. If a spoon can carry a message, a bed rail certainly can. Runes invite multitasking. Basic Futhark characters serve phonetic writing, but individual shapes also picked up symbolic charge in medieval and later glosses. A branch-armed form for protection. A T-like stem echoing Tyr for courage. Bind runes combining several sounds at once. People who could not read formally still copied shapes they saw on memorial stones or trade tags. Once a sign feels lucky, it migrates everywhere. Your host traces one angled mark and says it keeps drafts respectful. Another sleeper says it means the plank was once destined for a cart. A child insists it is a fish. Interpretation travels faster than proof. A favorite tale told round northern fires, recorded centuries later in written saga, but surely older in the telling, warns about careless carving. A young admirer scratches runes under a woman's bed, hoping to win her favor. Instead, she grows ill and cannot rest. An older traveler scrapes the marks away, burns the shaving, and carves a new, correct stave that lets her sleep. The bedtime moral is clear, even when names change. Do not copy signs. You do not understand where people lay their heads. You might be promising goats to frost giants when you meant sweet dreams. Look higher on the post. Shallow crosses, starbursts, little grids. After Christianity spread through the north, crosses joined the marked mix without erasing earlier habits. Households hedged bets by layering symbols. Folk painted rosettes and solar wheels on cradle boards, scratched X marks in lintels, inscribed brief prayers in Latin letters beside runes. Museums in Norway and Sweden display later box beds whose door panels carry hearts, tulips, stars, initials. The decorative descendants of serious apotropaic marks once cut sharper. Sleep spaces attract inscription because sleep exposes. Every culture invents a shorthand to guard that vulnerability. Patterns, letters, color, story. You test the wood with a thumbnail. Even shallow cuts grab splinters that catch lamplight. So marks show at night when nothing else does. A practical signal for groggy midnight hands feeling for the right berth. When several families crowd a hall, quick identity slashes prevent who took whose blanket arguments. A row of upward forks might simply mean, this stretch belongs to Ulf's kin. Function rarely stays pure. Once a mark claims space, it can also claim luck. Over seasons, the same cut defends both wool and dreams. Some marks get renewed annually. Your host says when first frost seals the roof, they scrape posts fresh, smear fat to darken grooves, and recut any line worn smooth by elbows. The act becomes seasonal blessing. Sharpen, clean, redraw, sleep safe. Quirky variation. A family inland rubs soot and whey into cuts so they swell dark. Children compete to see whose line shows longest through winter. Another hall burns tiny notch sets with a heated nail instead of cutting, making dot constellations overhead. Call that star mapping if you wish. Evidence flickers. We have spectacular formal rune stones and humble everyday sticks, but clear Viking Age bed hardware with intact carvings is rare. Later period bedboards, cradle ends, and wall planks carrying carved marks do survive. And while dating exact motifs backward is risky, Continuity of protective symbol practice from pagan through Christian centuries is well documented in northern folk art. Historians still argue how to read specific scratches. Was that an Algiz-like protection rune? A tally for nights away at sea? Carpenter layout? Or idle doodle? Context, depth, tool marks, and repetition across a site help. Yet ambiguity clings like wood smoke. You pick out one tiny branch glyph near your pillow, two short arms upraised from a stem, and decide, for tonight, it is root and crown meeting, a pocket world tree keeping drafts polite. Whether the carver meant that, or simply steadied his knife there after supper, changes nothing about how easily you fall back to sleep holding the post. Mainstream fact: runic inscriptions occur widely across the Norse world on everyday wooden objects, bone and stone. Carved marks on household timbers and furniture survive in later Scandinavian examples, showing long traditions of incising symbols, names, initials, crosses, motifs into domestic wood near sleeping areas. Quirky tidbit: saga lore includes a story in which miswritten runes placed where a woman slept made her ill until corrected, reflecting caution about carving charms near beds. Many later folk furnishings keep protective cuts, recut seasonally, echoing older beliefs. Historians still argue how to distinguish intentional protective runes from carpenter's marks or casual scratches on excavated timbers, and how directly later folk motifs map to Viking Age practice. You run your fingertips over the groove again, feel splinter grain, smell warm pine and old smoke, and let the idea, protection or doodle, both welcome, settle under your ribs as lids fall. Even in deep winter halls, bedtime does not fall silent. It sings. After the mid-watch lull and the slow talk about runes, children begin to resettle. But a stray giggle ricochets off the rafters when a scrap of snow slides down the smoke hole and hisses in the hearth. Your host seizes the moment, lifts a carved wooden hammer no longer than your hand, and bonks it lightly against a kettle rim. Clink, announcing that Thunder's friendly helper has returned to chase drafts from little toes. Laughter ripples, lids lower, the night's lullaby round begins. Northern cradle music does not need harps of gold. A stretched gut lyre missing 2 strings, a taut sealskin drum, a whistle bored through goosebone, spoons, voice, whatever fits tired hands. Archaeological finds across the Norse world include fragments of lyres. Notably, the Kravik lyre reconstruction draws on medieval Norwegian material. Bone whistles, and simple frame drums from circumpolar neighbors. Though dating and cultural mapping vary, people clearly had rhythm tools. For bedtime, voice leads. You settle with back against a post scored in shallow cuts you examined earlier. The same post now becomes a sounding board when fingers tap it in time. First verse: thunder is cozy. Rather than the hammer that smashes giants. Tonight's telling shrinks Thor's strength to a house guardian who bangs clouds together so roofs shake off snow and goats stay warm. The line, hammer high, clouds roll by, local paraphrase, times the rocking of a cradle board wedged between 2 bedrolls. Reframing a storm god as a nursery caretaker fits a pattern seen worldwide. Big powers softened for small ears. Later, Icelandic and Scandinavian folk lullabies often domesticate fierce beings. Trolls will guard the window. Wind rocks the child. Whether such reframing began in the Viking Age or filtered forward through centuries is unprovable, yet entirely plausible in winter halls where theology bends to sleep. Next verse. Sun return. Midwinter has passed. Daylight lengthens grain by grain, and people hungry for proof build songs that count it. A woman lifts 3 slender twigs. Yesterday's noon, today's noon, tomorrow's noon, and staggers their burned tips to show the change. Each repetition of the song moves the twigs a finger's width wider. You join the chant. Short tone for short day, longer tone stretched like a yawn for the day to come. Children delight in helping the sun grow. Hope is habit forming. In later Scandinavian calendars, carved primstav staffs notch days from winter to summer, while most surviving examples are medieval or later. The instinct to mark returning lights certainly predates the artifacts. Turning that count into lullaby lets families rehearse calendar knowledge without a lecture. Cradle engineering assists the melody. Infants here may be swaddled to a curved board, think portable baby sled, that can be propped near the fire or hung from a roof beam on braided lines. Ethnographic analogs from the broader circumpolar north and later Norwegian hanging cradles suggest suspension solutions were common where floor space was scarce. Yours tonight swings from 2 leather thongs looped over a rafter peg. Every tap of the toy hammer sends a slow pendulum arc that syncs with sung lines. Whether Viking Age hardware matched this rig exactly remains uncertain. Wood and leather rot. But post holes above sleeping platforms and rafterware patterns in reconstructions hint at suspended gear. Historians still argue how infants slept in different Norse regions. Board swaddles, baskets in bed, shared fur piles, or hanging cradles. Sparse direct evidence invites careful imagination. Between verses, adults stitch names into melody. Sleeper under amber. Little Bear Claw. Juniper Nose. Nicknames drawn from the charm strand overhead personalize the tune and quietly check that each child's amulet still hangs. Lullabies become inventory. One line thanks the land spirits at the door for keeping drafts polite. Another promises that if lightning ever visits, Thor will knock first and wipe his boots. Household theology at its finest. Manners before metaphysics. Instrument variation keeps dozers listening. The bone whistle draws a single high note that falls like melting icicles. The seal drum thumps a pulse for the sun. The lyre plucks 2 strings open 5th apart, leaving wide harmonic space so voices float. If you have ever relaxed to binaural rain apps, you already know what these families learned by ear. Sparse, repeating tones calm faster than ornate tunes. You hum along on a drone so soft it blurs into breath. A child beside you copies, then yawns mid-note and topples sideways into wool. Evidence of actual Viking lullaby texts is faint. We have heroic lays, gnomic wisdom, scraps of charm verse, later medieval hymns, and much younger folk cradle songs recorded by collectors. Scholars comb alliterative patterns in Eddic meters, for near dislag, Ljodahattur, to guess what informal home songs might have sounded like. Short, stress-marked, repeatable. Musical notation does not survive from the period. Melodic reconstructions rely on comparative tradition. instrument capability, and educated restraint. Historians still argue how close modern reenactor lullabies come to the soundscape of a Norse farm, and whether thunder-softening verses represent old habit or recent invention shaped by children's publishing. Yet the need that drives lullabies, repetition that steadies adult and child alike, transcends documentation. Quirky household trick to prove thunder can be friendly. An uncle rubs the little wooden hammer briskly on wool until static jumps. He taps your fingertip and you feel a tiny sting. "See?" he laughs. Lightning says goodnight. Scientific accuracy aside, the gag converts fear into giggle every time weather grumbles the roof. Mainstream fact: Norse culture possessed stringed lyre-type instruments, bone whistles, frame drums in neighboring circumpolar contexts, and a robust oral verse tradition preserved in later Icelandic sources. Households certainly sang. And seasonal songs marking light return are deeply rooted in Scandinavian practice. Later Primstav calendars echo the impulse. Quirky tidbit: toy hammers, suspended cradles, and playful static lightning tricks show how families domesticate large deities, Thor, the sun, into bedtime guardians. Similar softening appears in later Nordic lullabies that recruit trolls, winds, or saints to watch children. Historians still argue what actual Viking Age lullabies sounded like, how widely instruments accompanied them, and where pagan imagery blended into Christian cradle songs as conversion progressed. The hammer clinks a final gentle beat. The sun twigs rest side by side. Breath evens across the hall. You tuck your chin, still hearing distant thunder reimagined as a friendly knock, and drift into a sleep brightened by the promise that light is lengthening, if only the width of a song. You wake to fabric whispering as bedding shifts for guests arriving off the winter trading track. Sled runners rasped in the yard before dawn. And now travelers from far inlands and farther sea routes are shaking snow from cloaks and untying bundles that smell of salt, horse, tar, and a shy resin note that does not grow in these fjords. Hospitality matters in a thin-roofed world. So your hosts hurry to dress a stretch of the sleeping bench with their finest, what everyone jokingly calls the honor pillow line. Ordinary night gear, you know, straw sacks, wadmal, piled furs, juniper sachets stitched quick. But when respected company beds down, out come the treasure scraps, saved in chests and weight bags, the bright threads, stamped foils, clipped coin bits, traded beads that wandered half the known routes before curling beside a Norse hearth. A linen sleeve is turned right side out to display an inset panel of shimmering cloth so tight and even that ember light slides across it like water. Silk? It feels like it. Archaeologists have lifted silk fragments, patterned samite, tabby, brocaded strips, from rich Viking Age contexts at Birka in Sweden, the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, and other elite graves. Strong evidence that woven luxury traveled north through trade, gift, plunder, and reuse. Yardage was precious, households trimmed and pieced. Your host has appliqued a thumb-wide strip across the pillow's face, bordered in wool braids so the raw edge will not fray under winter elbows. Silver joins the show. Across the north, Hordes burst with Islamic dirhams, ferried up river networks through what is now Russia and the Baltic. Many arrived clipped into slivers and hack silver lumps for weight-based exchange rather than coin counting. Tonight, thin crescents of clipped silver are whip-stitched just inside a pillow seam so that when a guest settles, the line gives the faintest chime against the bedpost. Hear that? Your host grins. We kept some river moonlight for you. Whether Viking Age families truly sewed spendable silver into bedding for sound or simply stored it in pouches is unproven. Yet small metal tinkles from decorative mounts on textiles are documented. Turning wealth into lullaby flourish fits human nature and bragging rights without flashing hoard piles. Scents travel too. A trader unknots a pouch and spills dried orange peel dark as bark. Another offers a pinch of frankincense resin bead, hard as amber. A fragment bartered from a wayfarer who once served at a church storehouse far south. Spices this far north are festival rare. You grate a fleck, mix with warm tallow, and streak the honor pillow so the next sleeper inhales sun from continents away. Later written sources document spice movement into northern Europe. Chemical traces of exotic resins remain spotty but tantalizing in some elite burial textiles and vessel residues. People stretch aroma like storytelling. One whiff and every head in the row tips closer. Children campaign for inclusion. One stitches a tiny blue glass trade bead into the corner tassel. Another pins a bronze Thor's hammer beside the silk patch so thunder will guard imported softness. A third insists on tucking a juniper needle behind the border so the foreign cloth remembers where it sleeps. As layering local symbols onto far goods domesticates prestige. Treasure becomes ours when braided to home scent and story. You copy them, threading a hair from your wrist yarn, the fate loop, through the silk edge. Now destiny and trade nap together. Prestige textiles slip. Silk against straw is a skating pond. Honored heads slide off midnight. To stop this, the household bastes a rough wadmal backing under the silk strip so friction holds. Textile specialists reading seam ghosts in excavated fragments often find luxury face fabrics supported by sturdier wool substrates. Were those repairs, recycling, or deliberate hybrid builds designed for display and durability? Historians still argue whether the composite textiles and graves reflect everyday household solutions, ritual gear made special for burial, or heirloom patches redeployed at life's big moments. Below the pillow line sits a small balance scale, 2 copper pans on cords, a rod, pebble, and lead weights, because silver and beads travel by weight. Viking Age commerce across wide regions commonly used weight silver economies, clipped coin, ingot scrap, wire twists balanced in pans. Children practice by trading hazelnuts for dull metal slivers, learning hand memory for fairness. The scale is boxed before sleep, but setting it out while laying bedding speaks polite trust. Valuables will be measured, not stolen. Guests are honored in the open, not hidden behind chests. Trust is a blanket warmer than fur. You try the honor pillow. Silk cool against cheek, wool warm beneath, faint chink at the ear where a clipped Durham nub kisses the post whenever you turn. The resin streak melts slowly. You smell pine, orange, juniper. Trade collapses into breath. Outside sled dogs yip. Inside, bright scraps remind you that even remote fjords plug into caravan, river, and coastal webs stretching from the caliphate mints that struck those coins to the Byzantine looms that wove that thread to the steppe horse whose hair cords the fastening. Sleep becomes a map you fold beneath your head. Mainstream fact: imported luxury textiles, including silk, samite, patterned weaves, from Byzantine and Islamic spheres, are documented in high-status Viking Age burials such as Birka and Oseberg, demonstrating long-distance exchange. Large numbers of Islamic silver dirhams traveled into Scandinavia, widely evidenced in hoards and often clipped for weight-based transactions rather than used whole as coin. Quirky tidbit: households can, and later northern folk households did, showcase prestige scraps, silver bits, silk trims, aromatic imports, by sewing or pinning them where honored guests sleep, making sound, scent, and shimmer part of hospitality theater. Historians still argue how routinely imported luxuries entered daily domestic textiles versus being reserved for ritual display, and whether hack silver sewn into garments or bedding signaled wealth, protection charm, or just safe storage on the move. You settle back along the honor line, ear to silver, nose to spice, and feel trade winds you never sailed settle in your chest. Distant markets hum themselves into a bedtime drone, proof that stories and sleepers travel farther than footprints in snow. Dawn noses in under cloud, and the honor pillow's silver bits are pleasantly cool against your cheek. You roll over and notice something you missed in the excitement of guests. The air feels clear, not clawing your eyes the way a night's worth of peat and juniper smoke ought to. Somebody in this hall knows their winter physics. Before anyone can feign more sleep, your host thumps a post, swings a plank shutter at the ridge, and beckons you along a crawl through the narrow service aisle that runs between bedding and outer wall. Welcome to the quiet craft of keeping a longhouse warm enough to live, yet vented enough to breathe. From the outside, these buildings look like sleeping beasts. Low backs banked in turf, plank or wattle walls under sod caps, sometimes with stone footings where damp chews wood. Many Viking Age and early medieval Scandinavian farm excavations, Borg in Lofoten, Erik Studier reconstructions in Iceland, Borgund, and countless smaller sites, show elongated ground plans with central hearth features and side benches. Turf and timber combinations vary by region, but the pattern repeats. Insulate laterally, vent vertically. Thick earthen berms bank cold winds. Interior posts carry roof loads, so walls can be stuffed with whatever stops drafts. Turf sod flipped root out, seaweed, brush. Snow drifted against turf becomes bonus insulation. People joke their best winter carpenters are storms. Inside, heat stratifies. Fire trench low, sleep platforms higher, smoke layer highest. A good roof gap draws fumes. But in brutal weather, households throttle that draw to hoard heat, letting a smoke blanket float beneath rafters while cleaner air pools in the sleep zone. You see the system. Adjustable boards near the ridge, today propped wide. Side wall vents cut at goat-back height to bleed excess when animals share space. And a row of pebble-filled hanging baskets that dangle just below the smoke layer. When baskets collect soot too thick, they're lowered, rinsed, and rehung. Low-tech filter plus draft indicator. If soot caking reaches the cord knot, someone mutters, you've been stingy with the vent. Moisture is as deadly as cold. Every exhale, simmering pot, and damp cloak pumps water into air. Trapped moisture condenses in furs, encouraging mildew, lice, and rot. Some halls lay loose planks on short risers, a hand's breadth above packed earth so air can creep under bedding. Others throw crushed shell or charcoal under straw to dry spills. You step on a panel that feels springy. The cavity below holds warmed stones from yesterday's cooking pit. Residual heat dries the underfloor. Quirky fix. A perforated fish jawbone tied as a spacer holds bedding off damp turf in one corner. If you ever doubted Northerners recycle everything, behold the moisture mat cod. Because animals breathe heat. Buyers adjoin or share roof spans. In Icelandic and some Norwegian layouts, cattle bays anchor the windward end. Human living space sits leeward. Partitions rise chest high, so warm air drifts without hooves in the porridge. Dung drains scraped daily channel heat as compost cooks, barnyard geothermal. Yet proximity risks fumes and crowd stink. Archaeologists reading insect remains, phosphate spreads. And floorware still debate how consistently people co-housed animals all winter versus confining them only in storms. Some sites scream shared air, others split structures, climate, status, and feed stores probably drove the choice. Tonight's hall, goats in one end, cows outside in a turf lean-to, compromise. Light enters more by glow than window. Glazed panes belong to later centuries. Here, thin hide or oiled linen over slits admits gray without gale. Openings double as vents when raised on toggles. Your host lifts one. Exterior rime flashes, interior steam spills. Amber beads on the charm strand flicker as draft shifts. Visual draft meter built into decor. People read the rafters too. If frost feathers form evenly, ventilation's balanced. If one beam drips, heat leaks local and invites rot. Patch with moss, smear with pitch. Tell thunder to mind its drips. Fuel strategy shapes sleep. Peat sods banked to embers give steady low heat. Driftwood flares hot and fast. Resinous pine spits light but smoke. Many farms mix loads. Pine for cooking burst, peat for overnight hold. Experiments in reconstructed turf houses show that a modest ember line in a well-sealed hall can keep interior air above freezing, even when outside plunges far below. But CO buildup risk rises if vents close tight. Keeping that ridge crack honest is life insurance. Historians and building scientists still argue how deliberate draft control was versus incidental through leaky construction. Smoke-blackened rafters argue experience taught balance early. Weather vanes of scent tell when to clear air. If your pillow smells stronger than the hearth, vent. If animal end steams windows, vent. If condensation beads on post cuts you traced last night, vent. Families encode these checks in sayings. When the hammer weeps, lift the roof. Tears on the Thor charm. When goats paint stars, frost breath sparkles. Turn the wind. Household science couched as rhyme travels where formal manuals never did. You crawl up a short ladder and peer through the ridge slot. Warm plume meets gray dawn. Imagined from outside, it must draw a soft lane in roof snow. Travelers read such smoke plumes for welcome. Steady thin thread means controlled heat and likely spare broth. Roaring belch means party or trouble. Saga scenes of night arrivals often note whether light and smoke leaked from halls. Cues mattered when knocking in weather that could kill. Your own knock, if you made it now, would smell of juniper and silk spice from last night's honor pillows. A fragrant calling card on the wind. Before dropping back, you scatter a handful of dried kelp flakes over the hearth edge. Salt pops throw sparks that rise and test draw. If sparks hang low, vents too tight. If they race out, you're feeding ravens heat. Children adore this sea test, which doubles as trace mineral supplement when flakes fall into stew. A bedtime STEM lab disguised as snack. Mainstream fact: excavated Viking Age and early medieval Scandinavian farmsteads commonly show elongated longhouse plans with central hearths. Turf or timber wall construction adapted for insulation, and arrangements that in many regions connected or closely adjoined livestock and human spaces to conserve heat. Roof venting and smoke escape through louvers or permeable roofing are integral to reconstructions at sites such as Borg and Eirikstadir. Quirky tidbit: households used improvised draft queues, hanging soot collectors, salt spark tests, recycled fishbone spacers, rime-based vent checks to manage comfort and moisture during polar nights. Similar low-tech practices survive in later northern folk housing. Historians still argue the efficiency of smoke evacuation systems, the prevalence of full animal co-housing versus partial adjacency, and how actively medieval northerners engineered airflow versus living with chronic smoke. Back on the bench, you feel the difference. Air easier, blankets dry, eyes sting less. The hall's warmth is no accident. It's a night-long negotiation with fire, turf, breath, and snow. An engineering lullaby that hums beneath every story you've heard. After the morning vent check, the hall hums with a different energy. Someone calls for steam. Bundles of birch twigs appear from a loft, and you're urged, politely but firmly, out across the packed yard toward a low outbuilding half buried in snow. Breath smokes, dogs bark, and from a chink in the roof, you see vapor pulse like a whale spout. The winter north has many answers to cold. This one is hot stones, wet air, and a good thwack with fragrant branches before bed. Duck inside. The structure is small, shoulder-wide entry tunnel, low plank room sunk partly below ground, stone hearth piled with river rocks heated near white. A trough of water waits with long ladles. Benches tier up the walls so you can choose fjord shore or mountain peak heat. Birch switches, leaves dried last summer and now thawed in a tub. Shed green scent the moment steam hits them. Someone tosses the first ladle. Sizzle, hiss. A rolling white that erases rafters and coats your face in warm, wet air. Skin tingles, lungs open. Straw dust you've been breathing for nights softens out. Steam bathing in the north comes in many flavors. In Iceland, geothermal springs, log, let people soak outdoors year-round. Saga scenes mention travelers washing and talking business in hot pools before meals. Across Sweden and Norway, small bath huts or sweat houses, stone-lined pits or timber rooms fired hard, then steamed, served both washing and social rounds. Eastward, Finnic sauna tradition and the Slavic banya system refine the art. Superheated stones, rapid steam, birch whisking, followed by snow roll or cold plunge. Trade, intermarriage, and raiding tangled these cultures. Techniques traveled in boots and memory. Whether your host's bath copied a Finnic neighbor, grew local, or blends both hardly matters when every pore thanks the builders. Birch whisks, Finnish vihta or vasta, matter less for impact than for oils. Gently tapping skin draws blood to the surface and releases forest scent. Tonight taps are light, bedtime, not warrior bragging. A laughing elder flicks your shoulders. You smell green bark, summer sun locked in leaf, faint sweetness from last year's sap. Children take turns beating the bench instead of each other. Steam turns switches limp and safe. Add a few juniper sprigs between birch bundles, and the whole room smells like last night's hearth ritual. Associative chemistry gearing your body toward this is where we relax. Health and hygiene hitch a ride. Weekly or feast eve steaming loosens grime when melted snow baths would freeze fingers. Hot-cold contrast, steam then snow roll, slap circulation awake. Combing hair under steam evicts stubborn lice. Some farms heat smooth stones, wrap them in cloth after the bath, and tuck them under bedding. Night warmers with bonus clean scent. You volunteer to carry two. They ride back like bottled midsummer under your arms. Ritual threads into the vapor. Before major observances, weddings, seasonal blot offerings, visits from status guests, households wash. Clean bodies honor hosts and powers alike. Some communities speak a short charm while ladling water. Mist rise, worry fall. A Seid Kona, remember last night's dream guide, may steam before trance work. Others sweep steam with birch toward doorways to drive drafts out and welcome friends in. Whether Viking Age texts explicitly pair Seder and sauna is unproven. Yet practical cleansing before ritual is near universal. Myth lends meaning to what health already recommends. Quirky house recipe. Pour the dregs of malt mash onto hot stones for a toasty bread aroma. Travelers swear the smell alone feeds you. Another farm tosses crushed dried kelp, so brine tang rides the steam. Sea lungs, they say. Good before long indoor weeks. Your host jokes that if you add fish stock, you've invented warrior soup. So please don't. Nobody wants to sleep smelling chowder. Experimentation keeps winter interesting. Evidence bubbles up in pieces. Place name elements like lag in Iceland hint at long use of hot springs. Medieval accounts from travelers in Rus describe heated bath huts where steam and switches play central roles. Archaeological remains of stone-floored outbuildings with heavy firing signatures cluster at some Scandinavian farm sites and have been interpreted as bath or sweat structures, though multi-function barns can mimic the traces. Birch pollen spikes in sediments near suspected bath pits suggest deliberate leafy use. Wooden bathing implements almost never survive, yet metal hoops, rivet patterns, and soot lenses map plausible footprints. Historians still argue how widespread formal sauna-like buildings were in the Viking Age proper, versus expanding later. How often people steamed, daily, weekly, feast only, and whether gendered schedules or mixed bathing prevailed across regions. After several steam rounds, you step outside steaming yourself. Night air bites, snow squeaks, and you flop, egged on by cackling children, backward into a drift. Cold shocks lungs, but the rebound heat when you re-enter the hall is bliss. Skin flush, muscles loose, lungs clear of straw tickle. You slide under furs and drop towards sleep so fast you nearly miss the joke about smelling like a friendly forest. Dogs approve, licking birch water from your wrist yarn. Mainstream fact, bathing in sweat bathing traditions, geothermal soaks in Icelandic log, heated bath huts and sweat rooms in Scandinavia, and sauna banya practices across Finnic and Slavic regions, are documented in medieval texts and supported by archaeological features. Heated stone floors, firing residues. Heat steam bathing aided hygiene and social life in cold climates. Quirky tidbit, birch whisking, light branch tapping, malt or herb water tossed on stones for therapeutic or comforting scent, and carrying post-bath hot stones back to warm bedding are household variations that turn health practice into bedtime luxury. Historians still argue the geographic spread and frequency of true sauna structures in the Viking Age, the degree of Finnic influence, and the ritual versus purely practical roles steam baths played in Norse communities. You nose into blankets smelling of birch and juniper. Core heat banked like coals. Breaths lengthen almost immediately. If good sleep were a trade good, hot stones would be its coin. Evening stretches long again. But before bedding down, your hosts tug cloaks close and invite you for a slow walk just beyond the torch ring where farm lights fade. Snow rests shallow over low rises in the pasture, and under those rises lie the sleeping generations who warmed this hall before you. Moon glaze makes every mound a soft shoulder. Birch steam still clings to your skin. Juniper from the hearth threads the breeze. Out here you feel how northern nights fold the living and the dead into one long sleep cycle, separated more by turf thickness than by time. You crunch up the nearest barrow. Its outline shows through snow. Oval ridge of stones banked in earth. Grass roots knitted tight beneath the frost. Across Scandinavia and the Norse diaspora, burial practice ranged wide. Cremation clusters that left charcoal and bead scatters. Inhumations laid in wooden chambers. Boat settings where planks, rivets, and sometimes whole hulls framed a final birth. Monumental mounds like those at Borre or Jelling. Humbler field barrows near ordinary farms. Excavations often turn up grave goods, beads, blades, tools, animal bones, gaming pieces, scraps of imported cloth, tokens that say the occupants mattered and carried fragments of daily life or status into rest. Not every farm could raise a giant tumulus, yet many marked graves with stones or small mounds you could see from the doorway. So the first and last sight each day was kin sleeping in earth. Your guide kneels and brushes snow from a flat stone inset at the mound's crown. A shallow cup depression holds ice. In warmer seasons, it holds ale, milk, or melt water poured as greeting. Later Scandinavian folk custom preserves leaving food or drink at graves and at ancestor stones on feast eves. Some communities still set Christmas beer outdoors for those who cannot come in. And sliding that gesture back into the Viking Age is tempting. Saga episodes mention drinking at burial sites and raising memorial toasts. But soil rarely saves poured offerings unless vessels break in place. Tonight a thumb of warm ale melts the cup. Steam rises and vanishes into stars. Lights flicker in your peripheral vision, lanterns from the hall. Aurora smear, your own breathing perhaps. But tales say barrows glow when remembered. Children make games of it. Stare long enough and the mound will blink. If it blinks twice, you sleep well. 3 times and an ancestor joins your dream. Whether phosphorescent fungus ever helped the illusion, you cannot say. Belief does the rest. A boy plants his toy hammer, the lullaby prop, upright in the drift, and whispers that thunder should mind the neighbors. You follow with a juniper sprig from the steam hut. Tucking forest scent beside iron cymbal, blending nights. You sit on the lee slope and listen. Under snow the world is padded, hoof thuds mute, surf distant, only breath and cloth. People talk low, the way they did during that wake interval when fire needed tending, and stories roll from mound to hall and back. Here is where the elder who spun your wrist yarn asks her own grandmother, buried in this field, for steady hands at lambing, where a father thanks parents for the trade luck that brought silk, where someone admits fear before a voyage and presses a silver clipping, river moonlight, into the turf, so if ships fail, at least an echo of wealth stays home. Few archaeologists recover coins in field mounds because metal thieves and later plowing raid them. Still, stray hacked silver bits in secondary deposits show that small offerings happened. If not everywhere, then at enough farms to leave a glint. Legends soften death for sleepers. Instead of haunting wights, tonight the mound folk are described as good hosts who keep embers ready under the hill. When northern lights ripple, a door is cracked and warmth escapes. If you dream of that light, you have been invited for stew. More sober tellings warn not to nap directly atop certain barrows, lest you oversleep chores. Polite distance keeps livestock from damaging memorials as much as spirits from mischief. Practical rules: don't dig here. Lead cattle around. Leave a share of festival food. Become bedtime etiquette when wrapped in story. Evidence linking routine ancestor visits and everyday sleep practice is partial. We have mounds placed in sight lines of farm halls and paths. We have saga scenes of feast drinking at graves, legal meetings referencing ancestral resting places, and rune stones raised in memory of where living traffic passed. We also have scattered burials inserted into older mounds, layering kin over centuries, suggesting repeated return. Yet how often families physically sat on barrows in winter, poured drinks, or brought children for lullaby rounds remains uncertain. Soil chemistry and text silence conspire. Historians still argue whether the dead were imagined active household participants, remote honored memory, or variable by region and era. Conversion to Christianity overlays new liturgies without erasing sightlines to old fields. Quirky household rite on the first clear night after the season's steam bath. This farm turns one pillow outward on the bedding bench. Stuffed seam facing the door, so dreams can travel to pasture and back. In the morning, any feather or straw caught in the seam is added to a tiny bundle pushed into a mound crevice, symbolic exchange of rest between house and hill. It costs nothing, charms children, and keeps memory of field mounds circulating even when drifts block paths. You lean back against frozen turf, birch warm skin cooling, wrist yarn tucked inside mitten, and watch breath plume into the same night roof that covers barrow and hall alike. Snow crystals wink like the charm strand over your bed. Aurora threads resemble the spun fate braid. Somewhere below, iron rivets from an old ship burial might still align head to sea. Sleep is a bridge, your host says, short as a plank, long as a voyage, between the warm now and the rooted then. Mainstream fact, Norse and broader Scandinavian landscapes are dotted with burial mounds, cremation fields, and boat graves, such Bore, Jelling, Osseberg, many positioned within sight of farmsteads, grave goods including tools, beads, weapons, animals, and textiles show continuing relationships between living and dead. And literary sources describe feasting and memorial drinking at burial sites. Quirky tidbit. Later, Nordic folk practices, pouring ale or food at graves, turning bedding or leaving small tokens for ancestors, echo possible earlier gestures. Household versions, pillow turned outward, child's toy left on mound, easily fit winter bedtime visits. Historians still argue the intensity and regularity of ancestor veneration in everyday Viking Age domestic life. The shift from cremation to inhumation timing, and how Christianization reinterpreted mound landscapes without erasing their emotional pull. You head back toward the hall, moon bright on snow, feeling kin at your back. When you lie down again, every creak of timber sounds like the earth settling its blanket over friends sleeping just outside. Back inside after your moonlit visit to the pasture mounds, you notice something you've been too sleepy to read closely. Tucked along the beam above the bedding row sits a little fleet. Hand-carved hull slivers, ribbed bark boats, a shallow bowl with a dowel mast, even a bread crust, pinched prow first and dried hard beside the charm strand. By the goat partition rests a larger model scraped from driftwood, its plank lines scored with a nail, tiny shield dots painted in soot. When beds are made, these craft get set prow outward. When night falls, some are lowered to the floor or balanced on chest lids, as if ready to launch. Your host winks, we sleep, the boats keep watch, and when our long rest comes, may it be as gentle as tide slack. Ship dreams run deep in this coast. Actual ships carried some northerners into death. Burials with full vessels, iconic finds like Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, Ladby in Denmark, and boat graves from Salme in Estonia show people of high status interred within or upon hulls. Surrounded by gear, animal, textiles, carved sleighs, imported goods. Elsewhere, smaller boat graves place bodies in plank-lined pits, stone settings shaped like keels, or arrangements of rivets marking where wood decayed. Cremation layers sometimes include boat hardware mixed with char, suggesting vessels burned with the dead. Maritime identity, wealth display, ritual journey. all braid through the evidence, wherever interpretation lands. Water and voyage mattered enough to be carved into the earth. Households miniaturize big rites. Children carve bark hulls to race in melt channels. Travelers bring back scale-shipped toys. Bakers pinch loaves into long prows for midwinter feasts. A broken ladle becomes a turned gnar once its bowl is sawn and flipped. At bedtime, these toys migrate to head height, where story can reach them. One family lines a shallow tray with sand near the hearth. Each guest places a pebble crew in a toy boat before sleep. In morning, whoever's pebble has drifted closest to the water pot sails first when chores start. Play folds prayer. May all voyages tomorrow, large or small, find water and wind. You lift the driftwood model. Its ribs are exaggerated, keel deep. Someone has inlaid 3 bright threads from the honor pillow silk down the center line, a memory of trade routes stitched into hull. Tiny copper tacks dot the gunwale. In ship burials, real rivets stitch plank to plank. Here they're scale jokes, but also tactile teaching aids. Kids learn ship anatomy by feel. Adults rehearse voyage stories without hauling a real boat indoors. When storms pin crews ashore for weeks, fingering model strakes while dozing lets minds sail ahead of weather. Sea afterlives color the fleet. In northern lore, the drowned may feast in the hall of Ran, the sea power who gathers those she nets. Sailors sometimes cast coins or beads to her waters before voyages, so if worst comes, she receives them kindly. Some families echo this by dropping a bead into a bedside boat on nights when loved ones travel, payment prepaid. Later, Christian customs substitute small crosses or prayer slips. Both may ride side by side in mixed households. Tonight, an amber bead. Freya's tears in one telling, sunship in another, rolls in the bowl boat beside a copper cross tack. No quarrel, more tickets, safer harbors. Orientation games persist. Before sleep, your host turns each model so prows face the direction of tomorrow's main task. Forest cutting, shore fishing, inland visit, making a bedside compass that children check at dawn. On voyage eves, models all face outward toward the sea gap, a quiet collective wish. Archaeologists excavating some longhouses note rows of post holes or niches near interior walls that may have held small shelves. Whether for storage, icons, or toys is uncertain. Yet the spatial habit of lining meaningful objects at head height fits what you see now. Historians still argue how directly miniature boats and graves or houses symbolized afterlife, travel versus simple signals of maritime livelihood, context and scale blur. A guest from upriver recounts a cremation mound where only a scatter of clinker rivets and burned planks marked a vessel. Local tradition held the dead sailed in smoke. Another tells of stone ship settings on Gotland, where outline rocks sketch holes large enough to walk inside. Standing in one at dusk feels like boarding memory itself. You imagine lying down within those stone ribs, Aurora for sailcloth, and understand why model fleets comfort sleepers far from harbors. Quirky household fix. Cracked bowls become ice boats. Fill the bowl with snow, plant a twig mast, set a pebble crew, and leave near the door. As snow melts overnight, the boat launches, and in morning children judge whose boat traveled farthest by puddle trail. Melt marks double as draft checks. If water runs toward a seam, the door leaks. Engineering hides in play again. Mainstream fact: ship and boat burials, ranging from grand full-size hull interments, Oseberg, Gokstad, Ladby, to smaller plank-lined graves and stone ship settings across Scandinavia and Norse-influenced regions, demonstrate the symbolic and status weight of seafaring in Norse mortuary practice. Boat remains also appear in cremation deposits, indicating varied rites. Quirky tidbit: household mini boat models, bread ships, bead fairs, and orientation games let families rehearse voyage beliefs at bedtime. Similar small boats appear in later Nordic folk traditions. Soul ships, Christmas light boats, suggesting deep imaginative links between sleeping, traveling, and sailing to the next world. Historians still argue whether all boat graves signified literal afterlife journeys, maritime rank displays, kin group monuments, or mixed meanings that shifted over time and place. Debate also continues over how widely common folk engaged in boat-styled memorials versus elite households. You set the driftwood hull back above your bedding, with prow angled toward the pasture mounds you visited. An overnight voyage linking house, hill, and whatever quiet water waits beyond snow. With boats on watch and Juniper still faint in the air, you close your eyes and let imagined tide carry you forward. Snow squeaks sharp tonight, colder, drier, because word ran down the valley that the winter herding party from the uplands has come in with reindeer and trade bundles. And they have pitched their low, smoke-dark tent circle just above the birch fringe beyond your host's fields. You follow lantern dots up the slope until the hall's glow shrinks behind you. Ahead, hide walls bow in the wind, and a column of fragrant smoke threads through a smoke flap that blinks star and ember like a slow eye. You stoop, slip through the flap, and kneel into a world at once familiar and new. Spruce bough floor, reindeer skins, hair in for warmth, central hearth shallow and bright, gear hung on tripod poles, and soft human silhouettes ringed close. They greet you in measured nods. Names braid with places and herds. Someone pats a spot on a skin, and you settle where the ground is thick with insulating boughs that spring under your knees like a forest mattress. Say their name. Sami, S-A-A-M-I. In older Norse texts, the word Finnar often covers northern hunting and herding peoples. Writers further south blurred distinctions, yet trade iron, hides, furs, and knowledge flowed between coastal farmers and inland mobile groups for centuries. Archaeology backs the traffic. Reindeer antler gear, soapstone vessels, bronze ornaments, and whetstones move across cultural zones. Ski finds from bogs in Scandinavia show deep northern snow tech. Tax records from later medieval periods document crown interest in that flow. You feel the exchange in your knees. These people know snow. Sleeping here differs from the longhouse sprawl. A ring of spruce boughs underlays everything. Green scent rising like the birch steam you loved, but drier. Atop ride layered reindeer hides. Hair turned inward so hollow guard hairs trap heat. Pair two hides and fold edges up. Instant nest. Where colder still bites. Folks crawl into fur sleep sacks stitched hide to hide with the nap inward. Breath warms fast. so a small vent slit at the face keeps frost from sealing you in. A travel cradle of tied poles, polk, leans nearby. Infants ride wrapped in down and hide, then sleep in the same bundle unrolled by the fire. When seasonal movement is life, bedding must pack, thaw, and repack without rotting. Reindeer gives hide, sinew thread, milk fat, and motion. Your host from the hall trades tricks with the herders, how high to bank turf roofs versus how thick to lay spruce bough floors. One Sami woman unlaces her boot to show the moss stuffed inside. Soft, absorbent, an easy nightly change that keeps feet dry enough to sleep warm. She crumbles a pinch into your hand and laughs when you sniff forest acid and think of Juniper. Another pulls a tiny antler tube from a pouch. Charred ember carrier. Drop a coal in, cap with moss. And hours later, you still have fire seed when camp shifts. No trudging snow for flint sparks at midnight. Quirky brilliance travels fast. You imagine coastal fishers stealing the trick by spring. A drum lies against a pack, round frame, hide head painted in brown-red shapes. Rings, crosses, reindeer forms, sun discs, tracks. In many Sami traditions, a guavdis, shamanic drum, served for divination, song-keeping, and travel between worlds. Iron or bone markers danced on the skin when struck, landing on symbols that guided readings. Christian authorities in later centuries confiscated and burned drums. Yet specimens survive in museums. Paint schemes vary by region. Some mapping heavens, some herds, some saints layered over older signs. Tonight, no full trance. Instead, the drummer lightly taps the rim, so a heart pulse underlies speech. He traces a painted reindeer path curling toward a sun disk and grins at your hall's world tree stories. Every people maps above and below somehow, he says. And yours grows trees while ours runs herds across the sky crust. Stars matter for both camps. The herders speak of following snow sheen under moon, of reading wind scallops on drifts to pick sheltered sleep sites, of using the North Star as tether when whiteout steals ground lines. They watch Aurora, too. In some northern sayings, whistling at the lights invites them closer, or risks a snap. So camp etiquette keeps whistles low. Farther east, people tell that Aurora are the reflected flanks of reindeer racing heaven. Elsewhere, they are spirit fires. However translated, the slow waves you saw over the fjord now ride inside the tent through story. And you breathe with them, while steam from a stone pot dampens the air enough that noses do not crack. Food before sleep. Reindeer broth thick with fat, poured into shallow bowls. Dip dried meat to soften. Sip slow. High fat intake late helps overnight warmth, a metabolism blanket. Travelers stretch fat by whipping it with snow for a cold moose. Your spoon nearly stands upright. Shared bowls build trust fast. Trade happens easiest when bellies soothed before bargaining counts. Bones later smoke over the fire. Damp hide smells join spruce and broth, making a scent memory so distinct you will recognize it lifelong. Language trading happens in the drowse. Sami guests pick up the lullaby hammer joke. Coastal kids learn to mimic a short joik, the Sami style of song that names the essence of a person, place unheard rather than describing it. A father joiks the reindeer that always steals oats. Everyone laughs. Then he joiks the longhouse, a melodic curve that rises like smoke and lands heavy like turf. Your first time hearing your sleeping place sung as if it were a friend. Later, when you crawl under furs back at the hall, that melody will replay and stitch the two camps together in your dreams. Mainstream fact: Sami reindeer herding. Mobile dwellings such as the Lavu Goati, painted frame drums used in ritual and divination, many seized in the 17th and 18th centuries but surviving in collections, and long-standing trade and contact between Sami and Norse populations. Antler, furs, iron, tax relations are well documented archaeologically and historically. Ski finds and gear exchanges show technological flow across cultural boundaries in the north. Quirky tidbit: ember carriers made from horn or antler tubes packed with moss. Moss-stuffed footwear liners rotated to keep feet dry, and personalized joiks sung to people, animals, and even neighboring houses illustrate pragmatic and emotional knowledge swapping that easily extends to bedtime comfort. Historians still argue about the scale and seasonality of Sami-Norse interaction in the Viking Age proper versus later medieval records. The degree of cultural blending in religion and magic, Satyr versus Sami shamanism, and how accurately Norse saga terms like Finnar map onto distinct Sami groups. You leave the tent smelling of spruce and broth, wrist yarn warmed under reindeer hide, head full of a melody that is not words, but place. When you curl back on the longhouse bench, the two sleep worlds lie cheek to cheek, and the boundary between them thins like breath on cold air. Snow hush follows you downhill from the upland camp. By the time you slip back through the longhouse door, most lamps are low, and only a seam of ember light runs the hearth like a warm root. You nestle where your pillow still carries birch steam and juniper, and watch the charm strand, amber, iron, claw, feather, sway once in the draft before letting your eyes soften. In that loosening moment, the beams above lengthen in imagination, rising like a trunk. The side benches arch into wide sheltering limbs. The smoke hole becomes a high crown open to stars. And far below, somewhere under turf and snow and stone, you sense slow roots groping outward to find every sleeper you have met on this long winter wander. Breathe in slowly through your nose. Cool first, then warm. Picture an underground root easing beneath frozen soil until it touches the snow-capped mound where you sat and poured a thumb of ale for kin. Breathe out and let a ribbon of tonight's hearth heat seep down to them. In again, and the root creeps inland, finding the spruce bough floor where reindeer hides glow orange round a low fire. Breathe out and mingle their wood smoke with your juniper as if two camps shared one chimney. In once more, and the root curls seaward, brushing toy prows and real hull memories rocking on black fjord water. Breathe out, and tide wash feeds the root the salt it likes. A few more breaths, and every place rests on the same slow network, trading warmth the way people trade stories. You do not have to choose a single story to sleep in. The staff that traced the world tree in hearth smoke, the drum that sang reindeer paths across painted hide, the mound cup that caught meltwater, the silver-stitched honor pillow that chimed river trade, the birch steam that opened lungs, the rune-cut bedpost you touched in the dark. All can hang from the same invisible trunk because minds at night are generous builders. If one image steadies you, stay there. When it drifts, let another take its place. Sleep likes gentle variety served slowly. Across the north, people have long pictured a connector, tying above, middle, and below, so winter cannot scatter them. Norse poems remember a vast tree whose roots drink distant wells. Sami ritual drums map reindeer tracks arcing sky to earth. Other circumpolar traditions raise smoke posts, ridge poles, or spirit ladders that keep camps in quiet conversation with weather and with those gone ahead. However named, that vertical path recurs in landscapes where horizon snow erases familiar lines and long darkness blurs distance. Scholars comparing these traditions notice the pattern and trace how communities anchor identity by drawing an upward-downward thread through their living space. Not every scholar agrees which images truly correspond. Yet the echo keeps inviting study. The hall exhales. Tiny silver crescents sewn into the guest pillows chime once and settle. A goat shifts in the byre end. The feather on the charm strand taps wood like a slow heartbeat. If worry rises, weather, voyages, lambing, news from inland, count meeting points the way we counted charms earlier. Warm stone, carved post, juniper smoke, reindeer breath, boat prow, mound cup, amber bead. With each name, let shoulders drop and jaw soften. By the last bead, your breath usually runs longer out than in, which is what sleep wants. Some households along old trade tracks actually tie proof of visits. One reindeer hair, one boat chip, one pinch of mound soil into a single braid and hang it above the sleeping row so every tradition under their roof has a place. Mixed families have for centuries sewn iron nails beside saint tokens, amber beside crosses, moss beside silk trim. Objects travel and comforts mix, and beds quietly record the exchange whether or not anyone writes it down. Historians still argue how deeply Viking-age coastal farms blended Sami, Norse, and later Christian symbols in everyday domestic practice. Surviving finds show mixtures, yet context is patchy and meanings may have shifted house by house. Stay with the breath. Root down, branch up. Imagine meltwater beginning its slow spring climb inside the trunk, even while snow builds outside. If you wake later in that wide pause between sleeps, touch your wrist yarn and rejoin the root with one unhurried inhale. Let it carry you round the circle of friends you have met and settle you again among them. For now, drift. The ground holds. The tree remembers. You are resting within it. Mainstream fact. Comparative research notes vertical cosmology motifs across northern traditions. Yggdrasil in Old Norse sources. Layered realms mapped on Sami ritual drums, and axis markers such as smoke vents or central poles in other circumpolar belief systems used to relate sky, earth, and underworld in harsh seasonal light. Quirky tidbit. Contact zone households historically combine protective items from multiple traditions. Iron bits with animal hair, Christian signs with older charms, trade beads with local herbs, and hung these mixed braid bundles in sleeping areas to honor all parties. Historians still argue how frequent and how early such syncretic bedside bundles appeared in the Viking Age versus expanding in later centuries of closer contact and conversion. Evidence remains suggestive rather than conclusive. Before daylight commits, the hall rests in a gray that is neither night nor morning. Ember glow thins to a copper seam. Dogs breathe slow, and from the roof edge you hear the first ping of melt. One drop, then another, each bead of thaw finding the rim of a hanging pot and ringing it soft as a fingertip bell. You lie still and match breath to drip, in while the drop forms, out when it falls. A rhythm so unhurried it pulls shoulders away from ears without your asking. Outside, tide turns under ice. You cannot see it yet, but the fjord you crossed in story lifts and eases twice each day whether sun shows or not. And coastal families long tune chores to its pull, haul nets at low, set stakes at high, check boats when slack water holds them kind. That repeating swell hums under winter like a pulse through mittened fingers. If you listen, really listen, between wind and goat mutter you catch a distant, hollow thud that might be surf meeting shelf ice. True or imagined, it is enough to lend your lungs a tide of their own. Rise, fall, rise, fall. Above, stars wheel on the slow hinge of the North Star. The bright point sailors across northern seas have trusted for bearing, because unlike the wandering lights it holds nearly fixed over the Earth's axis, a dependable north even when coastlines vanish behind snow squalls or fog. Navigational poems and later sailing directions from Icelandic sources lean on that steady star. Farmers inland who never shipped cargo still pointed children to the one light that stays put when all others spin, a nightly reassurance that orientation survives the dark. You blink up through the smoke hole and imagine a very long spindle stuck through that star, turning the sky wheel around it. As the wheel turns, dawn slides earlier grain by grain, and winter unwinds. Household calendars grow from these repeats. Remember the sun-length twigs from the lullaby round? Each morning they are reset. Burned tips nudged wider. By week's end, children cheer the visible gap. Some farms notch doorposts when the first rooster crows before the gray, when goats begin to shed, when melt from the north eve drips faster than from the south. Practical phonology doubles as comfort math, proof that light is winning. Proof that. Later carved day staffs, primstaff, will formalize marks into saint days and work cues. Yet the instinct predates wood tablets. People counted what returned. Historians still argue exactly how early rural households tracked incremental daylight in the Viking Age. Sun shadows on thresholds, water drip bowls, knot cords, oral verse. But the need to know when to tap birch, breed stock, and ready boats guaranteed some repeatable dawn watching. Quirky trick. A shallow dish of snow set beneath the roof seam at night will freeze unevenly. If morning light melts one rim first, you learn where sun finds your hall earliest. Children call it the skylight soup. Another, hang a row of short icicles on a cord near the hearth. Then pull the whole line inside at dusk. as they soften. Each drop that falls marks a prayer, a story turn, or a breath count. When the last icicle lets go, it is time to bank the fire. Whether Viking Age families truly ran icicle clocks is impossible to prove. Melting leaves no rune. But later, northern folk games with drip timing and thaw races feel like the natural descendants of any winter household desperate for gentle timekeepers. You turn your wrist yarn, spun by the elder whose hands remember roots. So the knot rests over your pulse, and use it as metronome. Touch knot on inhale, release on exhale. Then listen for the roof's answering drip. Across the hall, someone hums last night's Sami joik of the Longhouse. A rising smoke curve, heavy turf landing, folding upland and coast into one breath. Another sleeper mumbles a line from the thunder lullaby and wraps a fingertip on the bedpost. The tiny silver chips in the honor pillow chime at random intervals like distant buoys. All of it layers into a repeating field of small returns that coax thought slower. Mainstream fact: Polaris, the North Star. Though not perfectly aligned in the Viking Age as today, still held a near-fixed position close enough to true north to serve as a crucial orientation aid for northern navigators. Knowledge of circumpolar revolving stars and the star that stands is reflected in later Norse sailing lore and fits practical coastal travel. Coastal work also followed tidal cycles that repeat predictably, anchoring winter routines in many North Atlantic communities. Quirky tidbit: families create miniature dawn and time markers, burn-tipped sun twigs, thaw dishes, drip bells, icicle lines, to reassure children that light returns and to pace long indoor nights. Similar seasonal household markers are recorded in later Scandinavian folk practice and plausibly echo older, improvised cues. Historians still argue how systematically Viking-age rural households recorded day length before widespread ecclesiastical calendars. Some see sophisticated observational regimes. Others think flexible, orally transmitted cues tied to work and weather sufficed. The drip quickens, gray brightens, somewhere a rooster coughs, under blankets bodies stretch in chain reaction. Soon the hall will stir, doors open, chores begin. But for a few more breaths, you float in the repeat, drop, tide, star wheel, steady patterns that have held sleepers safer than walls. When you rise, you'll carry that steadiness inward, into the quiet corner where charms, roots, and memories will gather you for the last deep rest of the night. You ease deeper into the hall's quietest corner, the little sanctuary where a low plank screen meets a length of hanging wadmal, and the hearth glow slips to a copper dusk. Drafts slow there, voices blur to wool-thick murmur. The floor is raised just enough that stored day heat seeps up through the boards into your knees. Juniper from earlier smokes clings in the wood grain. Birch steam hides in your sleeves. Above you, the charm strand, amber, iron, claw, feather, hangs almost still, ticking only when a roof drip shifts the air, like a patient pulse reminding the room to breathe. You unpack the season you've gathered in pockets and cuffs. The amber chip that crackled static and caught straw when you rubbed it. A green sliver of juniper needle rescued from the steam hut. The red fate yarn the elder wrapped round your wrist. The tiny hammer bead borrowed and politely returned. from the thunder lullaby, a salt-smelling pebble from the tide line beyond the boats. You nest them in a shallow carved dish and slide the dish under your pillow edge so every small turn brings a faint click, scent, or tug. A pocket map of every place that soothed you. If worry crowds, you can touch them in order and match each to one slow breath in, one soft breath out. The carpentry that makes this nest work is practical genius. Short return walls break cross drafts. Low canopy boards trap exhaled warmth. The curtain falls for modesty when guests bed shoulder to shoulder. Across later medieval and early modern Scandinavia, enclosed box beds and cupboard beds, planked sleeping cupboards with sliding or hinged fronts, become common precisely to conserve heat and carve privacy in multi-purpose rooms. Painted examples survive in vernacular museums from Norway to the Faroes and Iceland. Viking-age timber almost never lasts full height. Yet bench post slots, wall scarfings, and soot shadows at excavated farm sites suggest earlier screened or curtain bays that could have been ancestors of those snug cupboards. Historians still debate how direct that line of descent is. But anyone who has spent a polar night in a drafty room understands why walls crept closer around beds. Before you stretch out, someone lifts a flat soapstone pot from the embers, tucks a single glowing coal inside, caps it, and slides it beneath the bench by your calves. Slow, radiant warmth seeps through planks for hours. At first light, that same coal can relight the hearth without hunting flint and wind. Portable ember pots, stone, ceramic, sometimes iron, turn up in northern finds. Kitchens surely use them. Yet night duty makes homely sense when mornings bite. Quirky household flourish here. A pinch of dried kelp sprinkled over the coal, so the first faint scent is sea salt. A tiny promise that spring voyages will come. You tie the red yarn tail to a screen peg, drop the amber bead beside it, crush the juniper grain so green lifts, rest the little hammer where its head touches wood, and wedge the shore pebble so it cannot roll. In breath and memory the pieces stir, root from the fate spindle, sun chip from the honor pillows, forest steam from the baths, cloud knock from the lullabies, salt from the boats, mound earth remembered under snow, reindeer warmth from the upland tent, every thread gathered beneath one low roof. Households across changing centuries layered tokens just like this, without needing to settle doctrine. Crosses beside hammer cuts, Sami antler tubes beside rune slips, herbs sewn next to written prayers once writing spread. Some clusters were fashion, some insurance, some love. Scholars still puzzle which were which. The sleepers who made them simply wanted the night watched from every side. Lie down. Let calf muscles notice the coal's slow heat. Feel cloth settle across shoulders that still remember birch steam and reindeer hide. Listen for the drip clock you learned at dawn. Gather on inhale, ring on exhale, repeat until your ribs move like tide under ice. Imagine a root growing from the bedpost, sliding outward to touch the pasture mounds where you poured ale, branching inland to spruce bough fires in the upland camp, curling seaward past toy and reel prows rocking on dark water. With each breath, let warmth travel back along those roots and pool behind your ribs. Nothing new needs doing. Everything that helped you through the long night is within arm's reach and willing to keep watch while you rest. The hall is very quiet now. Embers rest like sleepy eyes along the hearth, and the air holds that soft braid of scents you've gathered all night. Juniper, birch steam, a salt note from the shore pebble, faint resin from the amber bead. You lie where warmth rises through the boards and feel the little coals hush at your calves. Let your breath move the way the fjord tide turns under ice. Slow rise in, longer fall out. With each exhale, imagine warmth sliding down those routes you traced. One toward the pasture mounds, one toward the spruce bough camp, one toward dark water and small boats rocking patiently. On the next inhale, let their quiet drift back and pool behind your ribs. Above, the charm strand barely sways. If it taps, that is only the room reminding you it's still here. Iron watching drafts, feather easing dream, amber catching stray light. Somewhere a drop from the roof finds a pan and rings once. Somewhere a goat shifts and stops. Nothing asks anything more of you. Jaw unclenches, hands open, shoulders settle as if tucked under reindeer hide. Whatever did not finish today can wait in the snow. Whatever must travel will find the path when light returns. For now you are simply another sleeper the world tree holds in its wide, steady limbs. May the silver sewn in honor pillows chime you safely through the dark. May meltwater find spring without waking you. May thunder remember to knock. You are warm. You are watched. You are welcome to drift. If you wake later, touch the yarn knot at your wrist and remember the breath tide. In, the hall, out, the night. In, the friends whose stories you carry. Out, the long, dark easing. Thanks for spending tonight with Restful History Stories. Sleep well, wherever you are. End of script.